Ghost stories. The supernatural. Humans are obsessed with death. This is true. Across every culture, across every part of time, we will find a way to create new stories about what happens after death. From ancient cave paintings to modern digital horror, we just cannot stop thinking about it, cannot get it out of our heads. And it's no different here in Ireland, the country I grew up in. Over the course of growing up, I found that our mythology was misrepresented, poorly understood. Not maliciously, more often than not. It's always coming from a place of appreciation. But it's very difficult to get Irish people to actually talk about the things that they believe in. Because believe you me, they still believe them. A lot. So I spent the last year going around the country and gathering just about everything I could. In this video, you're going to hear about child snatchers, forgotten soldiers, monsters in your garden, blood drinkers. I'm talking about real, honest-to-God witches and fairies. Yes, I know there's a lot of you that want to hear about those, and I promise we'll get to them. What I found out more than anything is the old stories are guarded. You really have to penetrate the defenses of the people that actually have them to get them to open up. You have to earn trust. And so I did the legwork. And here's 3 hours of the old tales. Just for you. Isolation is a damnable thing. Eyes dried from straining in candlelight peer down dark hallways of cold cement. Outside, howls rise over the ocean, unfiltered by civilization. There are no church steeples or apartment blocks to break the wind. Help is a ship away, and only comes after a telegram is sent, something you're not even sure you could do, even if your life depended on it. Peering through the slits on the secured bunker, cradling the rifle, you look out into the darkness. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust, stinging from the cold draft, but you make out a shape that should not be there. A soldier, like you, is standing on the concourse of Fort Mitchell, staring out towards the mainland. The wind howls stronger as you shout for him to get inside, that the storm is far too dangerous to brave and that he should return to his post. He does not hear you. A few seconds pass, your repeated attempts at warnings ignored, until finally he turns, and you are face to face with the hollow, dead eyes of the Gaunt gunner. Welcome back to the campfire. This week we'll be taking a look at Spike Island off the coast of County Cork. This prison predates the Republic of Ireland as a state, originally founded by the British Empire, but later taken back into the custody of the Irish Army after the War of Independence. Spike Island's prison was formed during the darkest hour of Irish history, the conquest of the villain Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell made a sport of invading Ireland in the August of 1694, burning cities and executing people for whatever reasons he deemed fit at the time. Soon after his conquest, there was the matter of prisoners of war. Many were entreated to death by the sword or firing squad, but the number of political prisoners accused of aiding the Irish Confederates was somewhere around 50,000. The decision for the Cromwellian regime was simple. To bury that many people, you would need a deep, deep hole. Cork City, home to the world's second largest natural harbour, was burned during Cromwell's conquest, razed to cinders. With the city being rebuilt under their control, the English crown eyed it up as a strategic location. A mere 14 miles from the city lay the town of Cove, a short boat ride from the coast of which lay Spike Island, a flat plain of an island, 103 acres big, and the prime target in the next phase of their colonization. During this time period, Spike was used as a shipping depot for prisoners being ferried to other places, likely Montserrat or the Caribbean islands. The true fortification of Spike Island began amidst the American War of Independence. England's vigilance was that of a hawk as it battled the young eagle, and the Crown was concerned that Ireland would be their Achilles heel should America choose to move the war across the Atlantic. To prevent the now United States from breaking down the front door, Fort Westmoreland was built on Spike Island, constructed in a star shape. The idea behind this was to create overlapping lines of sight, allowing for multiple guns to be aimed at ships at any given time. Once the Irish took over the fort, it would be renamed Fort Mitchell, after the Irish nationalist John Mitchell, who was imprisoned in Spike Island in 1848. During the famine, itself a genocide perpetuated upon the Irish by the English Parliament of the time, you had not only somewhere around 1 million Irish people dying, but also an incredible amount of convicts due to the desperation of the Irish people at the time, many of which convicted for the crimes of stealing food. The normal areas for prisoner transportation, such as Australia, held quibbles over what type of convicts were being sent there. The embitterment of the convicts was notable, and this made them difficult to handle. The scars of persecution always hardened into spite. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the rationale for Spike Island's fort as a defensive mechanism was diminished, and so it was quickly repurposed into a prison. On the 9th of October 1847, 109 men were transferred to Fort Westmoreland for detainment. 3 years later, the full star-shaped fortress would be functionally completed, and prison architecture began to be retrofitted to several of its buildings. Men and boys as young as 12 were held within the walls of this secluded island at this point. It even had a special children's prison, holding up to 100 boys at a time in what was once an ammunition storehouse. One can only imagine the overcrowding of the prison at this time, as the English forces were effectively laying the track as the train was moving. The fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants attitude led to a genuinely staggering death rate of the prison at 10%, with 1,000 men and boys dying in the first 6 years of its operation alone, many due to gross negligence. During this same period, up to 750 died specifically in the care of the prison's medical practitioner and surgeon, who was known to be drunk and hooked on opiates. 2 mass graves mark the island's horrors at this point. As the threat of the famine receded, the prison would again lie dormant for several years, but in the early 20th century, it would reopen to a large crowd of new inmates, Irish Republican soldiers and those accused of aiding them during the War of Independence. In 1921 alone, the island held 1,400 prisoners in internment. These prisoners were put to work there, but hardly treated fairly. One soul who is now known to be a potential ghost inhabiting the island is that of Captain Patrick White, a former carpenter who picked up a rifle for Ireland's freedom from colonialism during the war. He was interned at Spike on the 12th of April 1921, having been sent from Cork Main Jail. He had been an active participant in the fighting since 1914. When engaged in recreational time one day, he and some other inmates were playing hurling, Ireland's national sport, and the ball rolled outside of the area, past the wire marking the recreational area's edge. White reportedly asked the sentry if he could retrieve it, who obliged. When White reached under the wire, the sentry raised his rifle and fired, murdering White. Today, a plaque stands for him on Spike Island. While the captain is likely Spike's most well-known inmate victim of murder by guard, he is sure to be far from the only one. Today, it is said White can be seen in the prison, wandering halls he cannot leave, so close to the free land of Ireland that he fought for, but damned never to see it. Inmates, however, are not the only form of apparition which appear on the troubled island of Spike. For as long as the fort has had walls, there have been murmurs of another presence, a figure who keeps to ramparts and battlements, haunting lonely cold posts where soldiers once shivered through the longest and darkest of night. He is not a prisoner, but some sort of guard, a tall, hollow-cheeked, eyeless figure that appears in an old military coat, still pacing patrol areas or drifting through the casemates with the slow, deliberate tread of a weary man on duty. He does not speak or react when spoken to, and is seen walking what can only be assumed to be his old patrol, often disappearing into the dimness of corridors or around corners of the prison. By 1942, the Irish Army had taken control of Spike Island, converting the old War of Independence prison back into a military fortress. A lieutenant at the time was performing sentry duties during the night when he saw a person in an unusual uniform with an old military greatcoat walking the courtyard. Because it looked like the figure was holding a rifle, the sentry hailed him to identify himself. When no response returned, the Irish sentry levelled his rifle, aimed and fired, but the figure seemed to vanish. Doubting himself, he kept quiet until a superior came by to inquire. The lieutenant explained himself, and his superior waited with him for the rest of the guard. During the night, the superior also reportedly witnessed the figure and fired upon it. There are other incidents of this figure without eyes, this Gaunt gunner as he came to be known, being believed to be a living intruder and fired upon. When I heard this story, it reminded me of a remarkably similar story from American forces in Japan of the same era. So I made a call to my friend and University of Texas Rio Grande Valley history graduate, Manny Mejia.
So, I wanted to tell a story that was told to me by a good friend of mine when he served in the US military. When it comes to military, I have not served myself, but I've always ran in military circles my entire life, and soldiers enjoy a good tall tale. This is something that's consistent throughout every nation and every culture. Since going back to the Roman times, you've had people telling spooky stories while waiting for base shift to end. Our story today specifically will take us to the island of Okinawa, where in 1945, one of the bloodiest battles in human history occurred on a very small island. Specifically, an Air Force base that you can visit. Well, I wouldn't say visit since it's been Air Force Base, but it's called Kaneda Air Base. To get into the specifics, Kaneda Air Base and most military bases for that matter usually have guard posts. They are controlled intersections that allow access into the base and out of the base. And what's peculiar about Kaneda Air Base is that one of the guardhouses, number three, is automated. You might be asking why they would automate a guard post. It's because the military tries to avoid tall tales. They usually cite morale reasons on why they don't want people telling ghost stories, but that place has grown infamous for weird sightings. Okinawa is not a stranger to ghost stories. You can find plenty of tall tales, but this one has been a very popular one for many years and was encountered by my friend himself on a rainy night in Okinawa. When the battle began, the Marines were very surprised when they hit the beaches. By 1945, the U.S. Marine Corps had gotten used to very brutal fights against the Japanese when they initially hit the beaches and landings. When they hit the beaches at Okinawa on April 1st, they actually encountered absolutely no resistance. They used to joke that it was an April's Fool prank by the Japanese. But what really happened is the Japanese commander had withdrawn the entire force into Okinawa's interior. Okinawa is a very rocky and jungly island, so it's very easy for the defender to dig in and really make the attacker work to get them out of their entrenchments. To make matters worse, Okinawa had been overstaffed because reinforcements bound for the Philippines had arrived there instead after the disastrous Battle of the Philippine Sea. So by the time the Americans had hit the first line of resistance, they didn't realize it, but they had just started what would be the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Kadena Air Base back then was a part of that initial line of resistance from the Japanese. While it wouldn't be as bloody as some of the other battles on the island, like at Shuri Castle, nonetheless, many people died there, and this story is just one of the many stories that linger around that part of the island. It was a late night, and my buddy, for the lack of the story, we're going to call him John, was there posted by himself on guard duty. Now, guard duty in Okinawa is usually a quiet affair. It's a very rainy island, so the Marines will usually have ponchos and sit inside the guard houses, waiting for their relief to come in. On this particular night, John had been on his phone waiting for the end of his shift when he noticed movement at the edge of the jungle. Immediately, he put his phone down and went to alert. He was wondering if it was just another drunk Marine coming back from a night out at Okinawa. As the soldier approached, he noticed that he was very much covered in a poncho. Once again, it was the rainy season of Okinawa, so there was no reason to be alarmed. He simply waited for the soldiers to walk on, but as he got closer, he began to feel uneasy. He couldn't quite place it, but this soldier was off. There was no exchange, and he was a very quiet man. He wasn't making much noise as he moved toward the guard post. As he got closer and closer, that sense of unease grew within John. He told me when he was about 10 feet away, the soldier stopped, didn't really look up at him, but he uttered a single response. Do you have a light? So, reaching to his pocket to find if he had a lighter, he realized he didn't have one. And when he looked up to reply to the Marine that he didn't have one, he was gone. He immediately kind of went into a panic because he gotten so spooked. And when he went back to the barracks, he relayed to me, he finally realized what was so off about the Marine. By this point, this was 2015. The Marine that had walked up to him had been wearing combat fatigues that were used by U.S. Marines during the Battle of Okinawa. Now, I mentioned at the start that There are many similarities with stories like this around the world. In Ireland, for example, the legends at Spike Island are a great segue when you talk about the spirit of a gunner who was supposedly a British officer that had died on the island. You'll never find a shortage of these stories in every single military circle. There's always a creepy place that has some kind of urban legend, whether it's meant to scare recruits or whether it's a true story based off of first-hand accounts. But what I always found interesting about military stories, especially once they get written up, is that the military is held to a very high standard. So whenever these things make into reports, like the spirit on Spike Island and the spirits of Okinawa, these are decisions that could potentially affect professional careers of soldiers, especially officers if they decide to write their own reports. It's why I've always taken military stories with a little bit more grain of salt because these are stories that are read by superior officers. And of course, if your superior officer does not believe it's spirits, you're in a lot of trouble. Regardless, whenever these incidents where, especially if a firearm is discharged and it has to get written up, it's how we end up with these stories about ghosts wandering at night or spirits still manning their posts thousands or hundreds of years after the battles have ended.
The Gaunt Gunner is an enigmatic figure, anomalous in Ireland. We do not have a long history of military ghosts in this country. The identity of this soldier could be the likes of Captain White, or a British soldier who took his life on the island, as some speculate. It is not difficult to put oneself in the shoes of a soldier firing upon a ghost, especially in a uniform one does not recognize, during the year 1942. What is a lot harder to grapple with is the many sightings of the Gaunt Gunner, Spike Island's oldest sentry, across multiple decades. Thank you for joining me by the campfire again. Spike Island is a place of tumultuous history and frightening horror. Today, it stands as a destination for many dark tourists, with ferries running from Cove in County Cork. Perhaps we'll never know the full extent of the horrors which happened on Spike Island. Maybe that same terrible truth is exactly what the Gaunt Gunner is defending.
You're in a forest with a few friends. The sun is setting, casting a hazy golden glow through the trees above that contrasts with the greenery around you. You think nothing of the rustling canopies, the crunch of dried leaves in the distance. It's hard to tell whether the far-off laughter is coming from your friends or something else, something far more sinister. You've always been curious by nature, and something inside of you wants to investigate the laughter. Maybe one of your friends is playing a trick on you, so you decide to investigate. You wander deeper into the forest, far past what you thought your friends might have gone. Yet, ominous laughter still lingers. The sound of scuttling feet surround you as you continue. You're not scared, per se. The laughter doesn't really sound malicious. Your steps take you towards the source, and it drives you deeper and deeper into the trees. Despite your search being futile, with each passing second, the laughter turns into soft hums and melodic singing. It's mesmerizing, and you feel as if you could be here, now, forever, playing with these unknown things. All of a sudden, silence breaks. You are now alone. Your sense of direction is completely lost. You try to find your way back home through the forest. It takes time, but surely enough, you find a path. Arriving home, you're greeted by cries of relief from your family. Stressed embrace of their arms. It's hard to breathe. Surely you were only gone for a few hours. Why is it that everyone's overreacting? Your mother looks you in the eye and asks a haunting question. Where have you been for the past 2 weeks?
Welcome back to the campfire. In this episode, we will be exploring creatures of mayhem and mischief that dwell in forests. Later, we will be exploring strange phenomena in Latin America. But for now, allow me to take you somewhere far more pastoral, but just as rural. Like I mentioned in the episode covering the origins of fairies and fairy myth in Ireland, the word fairy is an umbrella term which refers to almost any mythological monster or creature in Irish folklore. My prime example in that video was, while often thought of as more a ghost, the banshee is a fairy. Another such one is the Púca, a mischievous spirit with the power to shift its shape into both animals and humans. They're known to cause terror and delight in creating experiences that leave people walking away confused or horrified, almost as though they feed on the lingering emotions still processing in the minds of those that encounter them. Recorded in March of 1938, the Púca of Killian is one example of this. It was said to inhabit the hills above the County Donegal towns of Killian and Meenagran. At night, it would enlarge itself and make, quote, a most horrible noise. The noise would travel down the hills and into the valleys surrounding the townships, terrifying the citizens. For the time in which it was active, nobody left their homes after dark, and cattle were brought in from grazing an hour before sunset. To resolve the incident, an aging priest rode up the hill to meet with the Púca. Taking courage, the priest entreated with the creature and asked it why it was so invigorated to cause harm to the people in the valleys below, to which the Púca replied, "I was a man of the world once, and I can get no rest in the next one." The Púca then told the old man what the reason for this was, and of that matter the priest never spoke, going to the grave with the knowledge of what caused this in the Púca. After being heard out by the priest, who was notably unafraid, the Púca left, and was never seen nor heard from again. The revelation that something kept the Púca from passing into the next world is especially disturbing if you've listened to my introductory episode on fairies, as you know exactly what world that is. Even more distressing is the priest's refusal to speak on it, leading one to wonder if it was deemed by him to be unholy to repeat. This story is unusual in another way that seems to imply that the Púca took a material form similar to a human, if not larger. This is fairly uncommon for stories of them, as they normally have a strict preference for animal forms, such as that of a goat, horse, or donkey. Whatever animal it chooses to inhabit, a Púca is denoted by its thick black coat and red eyes, often portrayed as shining with a mesmerizing light. It is also said that they are not perfect at imitating human forms, often bearing traits of animals in some way. A Púca trying to lure someone in with the form of a beautiful woman may outstretch her arms to reveal feathers, or a handsome showman's moustache may turn out to be an otter's whiskers. Stories of the Púca are just as varied in their audacity. The story of the Killian Meenagran Púca is untypically dark, as the Púca usually prefers to be a force of pure mischief, with little physical or emotional harm done once the prank has come to pass. Possibly for that reason, many tales involve a person who has been on the drink, and once the Púca bewitches them, they leave feeling rueful and used. They are also inherently rural beings, not seen in urban areas such as towns, though they make their presence felt there, like the root of the woods creeping into city streets. You can imagine the terror a Púca encounter could cause. There you are, in a pub, cozy, enjoying a nice meal with your friends before having a few drinks in the warmth. When you leave, you head into the abyssal void of 1930s Ireland's night. If you're lucky, you'll have the pale glass moon beaming overhead, and if not, the stars are your only natural illumination as you head for the hills to go home. The cold finds every possible weakness in your clothing to attack you for the entire walk, and it has begun to rain. From the corner of your eye, you spot it. 2 red beads moving steadily towards you, as if floating, not walking. In the County Cork town of Fermoy, a farmer had one such encounter, sometime in the 1800s. On one chilly night, on the way back from his horse stables, he turned to find a horse behind him, except this horse was not his. It was black in coat, with 2 gleaming red eyes. No sooner than did he have a chance to examine it, it drove its head under him and slung him upon its back, then took off running. It bounded over ditches and hedges like a bat out of hell. The story at this point compares it to the Sídhe, the fairy wind. The night itself was torrentially wet and horribly windy, but that did not stop this Púca. For roughly 5 miles the farmer clung on for dear life before with one swift gallop the Púca threw him off and into a bog hole, a sort of draining area naturally created for water. Imagine it as a giant mud pit that is flooded. They can be incredibly difficult to get out of, and in times of organised crime in Ireland, they were sometimes used to dispose of corpses that may bring unwanted attention. After clambering himself out, he began a disenchanted walk home through the howling storm. Having learned his lesson, the next night, the man returned from his stables, though he had made a change to his get-up by wearing riding boots, no doubt an exquisitely expensive piece of kit at the time. It is important to remember that in the 1800s, Ireland is far from a prosperous place. To go out and buy riding boots, which are also seen more typically as an English thing to do in a time in which Englishness was not looked upon very fondly at all, particularly in rural communities, is a very bold choice, both fiscally and culturally. Like a skulking phantom, the Púca appeared in the horse form once more and threw him on before he could react. Once set upon the back of the Púca, it began to run, and he deployed his countermeasures. He dug in the pointed, cold iron spur into the ribs of the Púca. Cold iron is a type of ironsmithing that involves cooling the metal at a lower temperature. This was thought to be a more natural manner of smithing, and thus more effective against the original people of Ireland, those who would later become the Fairies. Cold iron is fascinating enough to justify its own episode, but that will do for the purpose of this story. Recoiling in pain and letting out a whinny of horror, the Púca landed the farmer flat on his back upon the ground. The fairy horse took off into the inky blackness, and the farmer returned home with a grin. The following night, it visited him in the stables and spoke to him in Irish. "Are you wearing those sharp things at all tonight?" Afterwards, the man said nothing for a moment, and then they shared a few parting words. As it happened, the Púca regarded his ingenuity with laughter, and they departed each other as friends. It would seem he viewed the cold iron rebuttal in good humour, and he no longer bothered the farmer in Fermoy. Phenomena like the Púca are not solely found in Ireland. While many stories about the Púca boast a unique sense of Irishness, there are eerily familiar tales from all around the globe. For example, in Latin America, there is a force of nature that, while initially similar, truly has no equal.
My name's Lionel Justin. Lived in Mexico for about 9 years of my life, growing up there, pretty much. I spent a lot of time in many different places in Mexico. I spent a couple years in Guerrero, a few more years in Veracruz as well. And I've heard and seen a lot of stories from both places. So growing up in Mexico, there are a lot of like folk tales and stories. I feel like Mexico in general is very spiritual in a sense. A lot of the people over there are religious. We're all Catholics over there. It's very hard to find any other like people that are into any other religions. And with that, I feel like it ties into a lot with spiritual things such as ghosts, and other kind of cryptids. One of the biggest cryptids in Mexico being the duendes. Growing up in Mexico as a kid, I lived in a lot of surrounding spots where it was heavy forested areas, like pine tree forested or rainforests. And always whenever I was growing up, hanging around my friends or family, whenever we would go off into the forest to play or just to hang out and everything, we were always told to be very careful and be vigilant of duendes and everything. At the time, I really didn't know what they were or why people like were so scared of them. But whenever I was out playing with my friends and we would hear a rustling in the leaves further away, or laughing, or what we thought would be a voice in the distance, my friends would always be extremely scared and very eager to go back home because they were scared of attracting or luring or getting lured from duendes. So I mostly found out about them just from playing with my friends, hearing it from my friends' perspectives, and then questioning my father about it later on. And as I questioned my father about it later on, he would tell me some of their known traits, sometimes how they are extremely territorial whenever it comes to mountains and forested areas, usually sometimes making rock mounds or little wreaths out of pine needles and that kind of stuff. And as a kid, whenever you come across a little rock mound or a little wreath, you know, your first instinct is to go look at it or disassemble it or maybe knock it down. But it's really interesting because whenever I was out with my friends and I would see these certain things and I would be going after it to kind of like knock it down or mess it up in any way, shape, or form, my friends would always stop me and be like, no, don't touch that. You don't know who or what made that. And that would always question me. I would always kind of be like, what, like, why? It's just a little pile of rocks, like in the shape of like a house, or like stacked up on each other like a totem pole. For me, I never really understood what the fear was behind it, but for them, this was something so ingrained in their culture and something that they've been told stories of ever since they were a little kid to stay weary of, because they didn't want to upset these creatures, these entities, these beings, the duendes, because in the mountain ranges or in the forests, they would kind of like craft these little things to kind of show where their territory begins, or what spot of land or stretch of land typically belongs to them. And it's told in stories from their fathers or from their family that if you knock them down, it'll upset them, and they can usually get mad at you. And whenever the duendes get mad, they can either like send a curse on you and your family for like bad harvest or bad crops, or even maybe take one of you off into the forest, never to be seen from by your family ever again. So I feel like whenever talking to the townsfolk and them being brought up, whether it's from like people from little shops or people from my family, but yes, the townsfolk, asking them about it, whether it be people from stores or my own family or my friend's family, they would always speak about them very, very shyly, almost as if they didn't want to talk about them at all, almost as if saying their name or saying their word would manifest them into reality. They would always tell us stories about how they would take children away and how they would take them for long stretches of times, and how their fascination with children in general and taking them because of their innocence. I think that's another big thing to kind of like show light on, is that duendes are a form of, I think they're a form of creature where they act very similar to kids. They're very carefree. They're fairies of the forest, if anything. They love to play, they love to dance, they love to sing, and anything that kind of mimics these similar behaviors, such as children, they're cool with, usually. So that being said, whenever kids would go off into the forests and they would see or interact with these children that are so carefree, free of guilt, free of anything really from the real world problems, they would kind of gravitate towards them and want to interact with them more. Usually my dad would always tell me stories about how he grew up and how they would always tell him whenever going off into the forest, if he ever were to encounter something like a duende or hear laughing or scuffling in the distance, how he was actually supposed to blurt out bad words to kind of ward them away. So kind of giving it like the grounded reality of the harshness of humanity to kind of ward away these things from not wanting to interact with them. And I remember one of my dad's stories is that he would go out late at night with his friends, and they would just kind of be playing, and if they heard anything out in the forest, kind of like giggling, laughter, scuffling in the leaves, that they would all start shouting bad words to kind of ward off these duendes. But I remember specifically in one story, my father said whenever they all did that, they heard growling and gnawing as if, and sometimes even screeching, to kind of like them saying those bad words almost infuriated them and made them more hostile as they would run back to like their families to tell them about like the incidents. And one of the most interesting incidents from my dad's side was involving his cousin, whose name is Cesar. So Cesar is very interesting because he's the one person in our family who's struggled, or from my dad's side of the family, that struggled with mental difficulties. He never was able to make it through school. I don't believe he's able to read or write or do anything kind of like that. But it's really interesting because he was the main person in the family who had numerous encounters with duendes. And growing up, he didn't show any mental difficulties. He was a normal child going to normal school, learning at a normal rate. But every single time that he would go out with his friends or into the woods, he would always be led astray by these duendes. He would always pursue the laughter in the distance or want to know what the scuffling in the leaves was, finding these rock mounds or finding these wreaths around the forest and kind of continuing on to kind of venture and figure out what it is. And the more he would venture out, the more time he would be lost for, sometimes hours, days, weeks, months even. And every single time that he would go missing for larger periods of time. And it was really interesting because every single time they found him, he had no idea how long he has been away from his family for. Like he would come back home after a couple weeks and his family would be like, do you have any idea how long you were out there for? Like, we were worried sick. We had the entire townspeople looking for you. And he would only recall it as him being out and away for about 2 hours, maybe like half a day, but never that long of a period of time. And since he continuously embarked on those journeys of trying to pursue or even playing with them, because he even specified that they showed themselves to him, and the way that he would describe them is they were little cherub beings, like naked kind of baby angel things that were extremely well versed in traveling through the forests, leaping from tree to tree, extremely fast, energetic. He would even say that they had pointed teeth and elf shaped like ears, that kind of stuff. And every single time he would get not captured by them, but taken away from them, he would come home and it was almost like he would lose a piece of himself, as if he would lose a piece of his mind, and he would never fully develop and mature like the other kids around his time. He wouldn't say bad words. He was always very carefree and childlike. The older his friends got and the more mature things they started doing, he continued to want to just play and have fun and play hide and go seek or tag with his friends. While people mature, as we grow up, kids start doing different things, we start hanging out, we start going to arcades and everything, but he never lost that childhood wonder. And I feel like a lot of people that also have those experiences within the town, those people that have like those mental difficulties, have also had those ongoing encounters with duendes. Because I feel like there's two different ways that they could go about it. It's either the child continues to seek the duendes and continues to go out there and continues to kind of try and pursue them because they feel as if they're friends with them, or you have the child interaction where they come home and they're scared and their family limits their outside time, and they now know that if they ever hear or get like persuade or hear like these this laughter in the distance, or humming or singing, that they're supposed to just say bad words, throw stones, and then come home immediately and not spend any more time out there. But yeah, those are a few of those encounters.
So, the duende is a very interesting creature because it has many different iterations within Latin American culture. Latin America is such a large landmass. We're talking about Spain, all of South America, and a good portion of North America. But the duende is not similar through all these different countries. When we talk about the duende from Spain, that duende has much more in common with the European legends that are very close by in France and Ireland. Duendes in Spain are seen more as nymphs. A lot of the origins come from the Germanic invaders that arrived near the end of the Roman Empire. And most of the iterations in Spain of the duende is a simple mischievous spirit that like to live in abandoned houses. They don't do much beyond causing trouble for the occasional wanderer, playing pranks. They're very benign in nature. Once we arrive in Latin America, however, a lot of the duendes that we hear about become intertwined with the beliefs of the local Native Americans that lived there. Of course, the Spanish, during their colonial conquests, tried to integrate their culture and their folklore into the natives. So what ends up happening is you get this long tapestry of duende folklore stretching from the mountains of Mexico all the way to the Andes in Peru. And every part that you visit has a different rendition of the duende. A good example of the radical differences between duendes would be the aforementioned Castilian duende as compared to the duendes of the Andes in Peru. In Peru, the duende is much more aggressive. Spanish chroniclers record that the natives believed that the duendes in the Andes were much more similar in nature to succubi. They were called huarcalas, and they're believed to inhabit sacred alder trees within the mountains. These trees are considered sacred to the natives, and they are believed to manifest through voices that were generated with great fervor. The people considered these trees to be spirits that must be worshipped and protected. It's also said that priestesses would be consecrated to the service of the forest spirits. These duendes played a dual role within the native society. Sometimes they could be seen as hostile or negative, especially when you look at it from the point of view of the Spanish. But many of the locals saw them more as part of the world. They weren't inherently evil, they were simply there and had always been there. Now, when we move on to the folklore of Mexico and the American Southwest, that's where the duendes become more similar to what the Spanish belief was. A lot of the duendes within Mexico were seen as the aforementioned mischievous Castilian ones, but they were a tad more hands-on with the way they behaved. A lot of Mexicans grew up believing that duendes would clip their toenails, and if you're unlucky, they'd actually take the entire toe. It was why they practice hygiene tactics like cutting your toenails, because there's always this fear that a duende would come and snip it for you if you weren't careful. But in that context, the duende goes from being this spirit, as it's seen more so in South America, to being this kind of vagabond character that only inhabits uninhabited parts of the country. A lot of the folklore around the duende also describes them as these gnomish type creatures. They are very small, they are very agile, and they, generally speaking, don't interact with people and are rarely seen by people. The last part to mention would be the duendes of the Philippines. Now, those duendes are much more aggressive, and they're seen much more aggressive spiritually by the people of the Philippines. The people believe that the unvisited dark parts of a house or anthills would always carry a spirit of a duende. They were seen as old men, and they could actually be considered good or evil based upon the color that you saw them in. White was associated with good, while black was associated with evil. And it's often said that those people would interact with duendes, and what would happen then would then dictate what would happen to them, whether it be a good or a bad spirit. It was seen as taboo to offend one of these spirits, and it was also believed that if you angered a duende, it would pretty much confer misfortune upon your house. Another place worth mentioning the legend of the duende that also comes from one of the former Spanish colonies would be the Philippines. While the Philippines aren't generally considered to be part of the Latin American culture world, they also have strikingly similar tales surrounding duendes. The Chamorro people in the Marianas, which is adjacent to the Philippines, talk about a spirit called the Tatomona. This spirit is believed to be, to some people, a good spirit and believed to be a bad spirit. Some of them see them as helpful or shy creatures, while others of them believed to be mischievous, and they eat misbehaving children. When we arrive in the Philippines itself, Duendes are believed to once again inhabit places that are not normally tread by people. They enjoy to hide within rocks and caves, old trees, or the darker parts of the home, in anthills and termite mounds. They believe duendes are classified between two separate castes. The first caste would be the good caste. These are identified with the color white. These spirits are helpful, and they often look over children and they assist the household, versus the black ones, who are often said to be evil in nature. These are the mischievous ones. They are the ones that enjoy to pull pranks and they enjoy to cause mischief within the house. Offending one of these spirits is a deep taboo to the Filipino people, and people are believed to be cursed by duendes when they anger the spirits.
Thank you for joining me again by the campfire. When visiting friends in Texas not so long ago, a long conversation between them and I, comparing duendes to fairies, led me to embarking on this very show you're listening to right now. The intertwining and commonalities, even in our nightmares and demons, have the power to foster connections across borders, across oceans, and across time. Don't visit forests after dark. Do not follow the laughter. If you hear wind chimes, turn around and run in the opposite direction. And if you spot 2 red orbs approaching you, reach for iron, and then pick a god and pray that it was forged cold. Earlier this year, after a long and brave battle with dementia, I lost my grandfather. Dan Spillane was such a mysterious titan of a man that he almost warrants his own set of stories, but there is one in particular that replays often in my mind. When I was young, my father would take me up the hills and deep into the Irish countryside. Up where the roads married the trees, past the glades that seemed in perpetual twilight, and higher again to a rounded hilltop which overlooks a glorious verdant valley below, which would land us at the house where my father grew up in. Dan Spillane was an active man for his entire life. His father, my great-grandfather, fought in the Great War under a star-spangled banner, likely with the intentions to emigrate to America, but found himself needing the quiet of County Kerry after all he had seen as a dispatch rider in France with the Fighting 69th. In his formative years, Dan found it difficult to communicate with his father, likely due to what was then called shell shock, now post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Rather than stay indoors in the farmhouse and spend all day bickering over God knows what, possibly who ate the last packet of biscuits, knowing my blood, Dan spent his days making himself busy on the farm. The hill was awful land bought by my grandfather with his wartime salary, infertile and ungainly. By the time my father was born, Dan had resurrected the life of the land itself on top of that hill, and earned the recognition of the entire local community. The point that I'm making is that my grandfather was, as I choose to remember him before the dementia took hold, a relentless man who seemed to never grow weary or take a break, which I readily admit is a worldview that I find admirable, yet difficult to understand. My generation knows comforts that he could not fathom, but more than that, he was tough and spent his life working that land. So it was one summer spry day that my father, a glazier by trade, came to fix a window in the farmhouse, and I was spending all day with my grandfather. Most memorably, we loaded into his Jeep things I can no longer recall, chicken wire and fence posts and other miscellany, and we set off for the fields with the herding dog in the back seat to bring the cows into the milking parlour. On the way down the bumpy hilltop roads, the Jeep stopped twice. The first time, "I must check something there, Sean, stay in the Jeep a minute." That's all he told me. I was happy to do as I was told, and my mind began to wander. But after only a minute or so, he returned, sat in the Jeep, and we moved on. Went down the road again, passed the bend, stopped again. "One second, Sean, I must check something here too." When he returned, instead of the door of the driver's side, he opened the hatch at the rear of the Jeep, and in his hand he held a dead hare, and explained that the trap got him. As my grandfather, who kept taxidermy of some of his hunts, sunk in a knife he produced from somewhere in the back and began to skin the hare before my eyes, he spoke, "Don't worry, Sean, it's fine if you do it during the day." I don't judge him for ridding his farm of what was, to a man who cultivated terrible land into something enviable by farmers worldwide, a pest. Even then, despite my horror at seeing the insides of this poor animal being pulled outside, I could comprehend it, queasy as it felt to watch. At the time, the meaning of his words were lost on me. Knowing what I know now, they're all I can focus on. Welcome back to the bonfire. In February of 2025, members of the Lynch family near Castle Island in County Kerry began noticing strange visitors encroaching upon their farmland. After speaking with them a few months ago and hearing their story, I decided it was time to hit the books and put a capstone on this old memory from my childhood. Hares and rabbits are often associated with luck, so that was where my research mostly began. While both have their places in the folklore, rabbits and hares do have distinct connotations in the Irish pagan mythology, which is where you see animals come up the most. Interestingly, it is more often seen as bad luck to consume a hare rather than the animal prescribing good fortune outright. To see one is to know that good fortune exists, but that does not inherently mean that it would fall onto the observer of this animal. In one early myth, Oisín of the Fianna encounters a hare and manages to wound it. He follows it through the brush, hedgerow, and mists until he finds a door in the hillside through which a trail of blood leads. Passing through, he encounters a young woman bleeding from her leg, who explains that not only is she a member of the Sídhe, the denizens of the other world, but also that hares are the preferred form of Sídhe women when they leave the other world and step into ours. From that day forward, because of the experience, Oisín swore again to never eat a hare. Thus, the superstition begins. A story recorded in County Cork recalls the tale of two huntsmen and their hounds chasing and killing a hare in the graveyard, or a local graveyard. When the huntsman took the hare from his hound's mouth, it soon after began to swell and then wither until it rotted off completely. The dog remained unharmed, but the man died soon after. A common saying in Cork and Kerry, and one that I often heard growing up, was that if you are out late, especially at night, and you see a hare, you turn around and do not look back, for it presages death or grief. The cry of a hare is also horrifying, especially a pain cry, and like the fox, it has often been given as a possible suggested explanation for the famous wail of the banshee. One commonality between all of these stories is the time they tend to occur. Not a single one occurs during broad daylight. The hare is an inherently liminal creature encountered by mankind most often at dusk or dawn due to their nocturnal nature. And to harm one when it is simply minding its own business and you should be asleep is to invite a sort of negative karma. However, the hare also represents fortune. The hare is an incredibly agile, bounding creature racing forward. A prey animal, careful but fast, wary but adventurous, brings the hare towards positive connotations. It is all of the risk and the reward and the thrill of the concept of discovery itself. For many, however, the hare represents something different. The twilight it exists in ties in deeply with the Samhain, the veils between worlds, the other world. And this brings us back to the Lynch family, who lost a family member this year. I offer them both my condolences for what has happened to them and my thanks for taking the time to share their story with me. Shortly before the passing of a loved one, the family began to run into hares at an unusual rate and outside of their typical season. Not only that, but for a notoriously flighty prey animal, they had an uncanny fearlessness. While they were unaware their loved one was dying at the time, the feeling these encounters created is impossible to disregard. This is what they had to say.
February. And sometime in February they started appearing.
Yeah, and she didn't die till when it went to the
April.
20th April.
20th, she died.
Yeah.
Maybe 6-7 weeks before it. We've seen the hares all out. We've seen an awful lot of hares. And even before that, it said there was one into the, there's beyond about in the house below. I was been looking in the windows and stuff.
Yeah, but that would be passing here as well. I thought they'd be coming down from the mountain as well. Like they live out the mountain, so they would be going through the yard as well. You know.
Yeah, and all
that
over.
would be kind of a natural thing.
We would only have one at a time.
Yeah.
But we were seeing, like I met 2 sets of pairs at least going down the road a few nights.
But we wouldn't be meeting them down the Waterheen at all. Like the road going down there, we call it the Waterheen. You know. You would have had a very rare would meet here.
And you would only meet
maybe a rabbit or something, But we would have any time I got to town, I was go to town at night, I'd meet him going or maybe coming, maybe both times. And he'd been the road in front of us, and he'd run away, then he'd go away.
They were not like normal at all. They were very quiet. They were no fear no. Like usually if we come across the hare, they're gone as fast. But these ones, there was no fear.
Hanging around like.
And they were like they'd no fear of you. They'd move out of the way, but there'd be no panic,
But these were waiting for you to come on them, like.
They seemed to wanting to watch you.
Yeah, and then they'd run then in front of the car, like.
But there'd be no panic, like there'd be no.
No, you would have to slow down and stuff and take our time. Yeah, that wouldn't something that fly out.
They'd adapt out the way. What is more?
I suppose we were all noticing, but we weren't talking about it at all. Because we wouldn't take that much notice, like, until everyone started seeing them, like, morning and night. You were looking at them, and they'd be hanging around. They'd be even hanging around the sheds over there. You'd never see them around sheds, like, the shed over the yard there. Now we would get and look out the window there. That would be over there, like, if we're upstairs now, looking out the window, you could see them passing.
Yeah, there's always a hare up the mountain there. You'd always come across one like that, and he'd move out, we'd be gone. There tends to be no panic, There was a lot of them, like coming across two pairs within 100 yards. Well, the top of the road and halfway down there, we've never seen two pairs around like that. Yeah, but as they're looking into the window, they creep out a bit.
After all this time, I still cannot confidently say that I understand the hare in the cultural context of Ireland. An omen of fortune or ill favour, the calling card of the reaper, or the gift of discovery. I know what it meant to my grandfather now, though. It was something to be respected. Taxidermy likely seems brutish to many in this day and age when it has fallen out of favour, but there is a form of respect in it. Seasoned hunters often advise younger ones to use the whole animal, waste nothing taken from nature. I think my grandfather was a man who did what needed to be done, but kept a respect for the world around him. In the context of who he was and what he did, that's certainly something I can rationalize. He spent his whole life nursing one plot of land and making something out of it that was not there before he was there. The hare remaining a mystery seems oddly fitting for a creature torn between two worlds, beholden not to dark nor belonging to the light. Perhaps respecting the hare means understanding that you may never hold dominion over that which it is. For a moment that you find yourself alone in the woods. The air is crisp and cold. Around you, the usual din of nature ceases to exist. The hair on the back of your neck raises. You have heard of this. A night in Ireland upon which the seams between our world and that of the other kinds that dwell beyond our perception rip and strain, the veil thinning out in certain places. You are certain, beyond all doubt now, that you are in one of those places, on the worst night to happen upon one. The silence forces each muscle in your body to coil up like a drawn bowstring. You freeze, unsure what to do, or if you can do anything at all. Snap, crack, from a nearby hedgerow, a fox staring directly at you. Beyond him, a stag's eyes bore into you. You thank your God, maybe a few of the other ones too, just to throw more names in the hat for this relief. Your muscles unroll like a tide, all the while unaware of what's creeping up behind you. Thank you for joining me. My name is Sean Spillane. I've spent the last year collecting stories, eyewitness accounts, and anecdotes of the most strange and sinister sides of Irish folklore and mythology. Welcome to Tales Unbound. On this visit to the bonfire, we will be discussing the origins and roots of Samhain, the Irish festival which later became Halloween, and one of the earliest stories of a haunting on All Hallows Eve ever recounted. To introduce the Samhain, I invited Dr. Declan Downey to speak about the origins of Halloween as the Samhain and the early stages of its evolution to what we know today.
Well, we're approaching Samhain. which is the beginning of the Celtic year. It's not the end, it's the beginning. It's the time of year when nature begins to go quiet, and people associated with death, they associate it with great silence in the countryside, that there's no growth, but in fact there is growth, but we don't see it. It's what's underneath the ground. All the energy that plants had built up over the spring and summer, the chlorophyll, all of that, it's energy that's stored back into the roots, fed into the roots, so as to give rise to that new burst of growth in the spring. It is also a time for cleaning up the land, clearing the drains, the ditches, the farms, etc., sorting out the gardens as well. So it's an interesting season because it's a season of quietness and preparation. And that's the preparation leading into the new life. In the darkness of the womb, life begins. And so we are entering into the darkness of the womb again now that the sun has set on the year here in the northern hemisphere. And that's what our ancient ancestors understood from this cycle. So with Samhain, there was this belief as well that the veil between this world and the next world, the other world, was thin or would be parted even. There's various interpretations. Some say that the veil is opened, others say it's just very thin. But whatever way we want to describe it, the veil is not as strongly closed. And that allows for the spirits of the old world, the spirits of the other world to return. This was the belief, and that is why people at this time of the year wore a mask when they went out, especially at night time. So the wearing of masks, it wasn't meant to scare people, it was meant to protect people from the spirit world in case spirits would claim them and bring them back with them to the other world. And you might ask, why would they want to do that? Well, it could be a malevolent spirit, for instance, seeking a slave from this world to serve them in the next. Or it could be someone seeking revenge. They didn't live long enough to take revenge on them while they were alive, so even better if they could get them while they were dead. They're all-powerful spirit. So people wore masks, the Ig fiddle, and the masks were designed as a way to protect people when they went walking about, especially at night time, the dark hours during this time of year. So here we see the origins of the modern Halloween. Now, Halloween itself comes from the Old English All Hallows Evening. The een, there's an apostrophe between the two e's. That represents the eve or the evening. Hallow means a saint, a holy person. So in the Christian calendar, the 1st of November is All Saints' Day. And the Christians, the early Christians, came to these parts, Ireland, Britain, the Celtic world, shall we say, Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall, Brittany, northern Spain, Galicia. This tradition of Samhain was very strong in these places, and when the early Christians arrived, they didn't obliterate the ancient pagan festivals. They didn't even obliterate paganism. They merely adapted. And it's very interesting when you look at Irish history. We had no martyrs in the early Irish church, the 5th, 6th centuries. There were no martyrs. Martyrdom comes into the Irish church after the Reformation in the 16th, the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's one group of Christians killing another group of Christians. So you see how well they love each other. Anyhow, the thing is, that in the ancient Irish church, many of the early Irish saints that we know of, like Bridget or Senan or Alton, or any of these saints, Laserian indeed, you read their lives, and when you look at the stories connected with them, you realize that a lot of them were Druids or came from that tradition. The shape-shifting, all of that, magic cloaks, that sort of thing. This is pure Druidism, but it is adapted. And many would say that the ancient Druids regarded Christianity as a logical extension of Druidism, and in many ways it is. So that is when you look at Christianity and you confine it to the 4 Gospels of Christ. Forget about St. Paul, forget about the Old Testament, just look at the 4 Gospels and the way of living that Christ encourages. So that is very, very it's very well aligned, it's compatible with Druidism. So this is where, as I say, All Hallows comes from. It was the All Saints evening, the Eve of All Saints. So it's a festival, an old Druidic festival that marks the passage from summer or autumn into winter, but also it emphasizes the growth that's taking place in the silence, in the darkness, that will give rise to fresh burst of greenery in the spring. So it's interesting that when we look at the Halloween festival, then it comes to the fore with Imbolc in the spring. And Imbolc is around the 1st of February. It's the feast of St. Bridget. And Bridget is the patroness of livestock, of growth in the gardens, new life, spring growth. So again, you can see where the Christianity and the Druidism intertwine here. And again, both are fire festivals as well. And the ashes from the fires, in fact, were often stored and used as potash to spread on the land to encourage new growth, potassium and minerals from that into the ground. So, but also there were purification rituals during these times, at Halloween, at Imbolc, at Bealtaine in the 1st of May, the summer festival, and Lunasa then in the autumn. They're all fire festivals, but the idea was that the herds of cattle and sheep and horses would be led through 2 bonfires. And then when the bonfires had burnt down, the herds were driven back over the ashes, because it was a purification ritual, but also it was believed that the minerals in the ash would help prevent hooves from being diseased. So when you think of the foot and mouth disease that plagues so many animals nowadays in farms and that type of thing. So this is where these traditions come from. And as I say, the Halloween Samhain is the beginning of new growth, new life. It marks an ending of one year and the beginning of a new year. So that's why it's a very important festival in the ancient Irish world. Now, nowadays, when we think of Halloween, we see this crass commercialism everywhere, and we see a lot of American ideas, and particularly from Hollywood, and zombies and horror films and that sort of thing coming into it, and Dracula and Frankenstein and all of that. That was not part of the original Halloween, not part of the original Samhain. The original Samhain was all about protecting oneself against evil spirits, or spirits that might try to wreak vengeance on you for something you did to them when they were alive. That's why you wore the mask. it's also a time of divination. That's why we had the ancient games with the bobbing apple or the snap apple, or the saucers with the earth and the rings and the peas and the matchsticks and all of that, and the water. These divination rituals, they were all part of the games. And then when we look at the turnip or the cooking apple, this was the special skill of the man of the house to carve out a frightening skull or head from these things. Now, try to carve a pumpkin with a knife. It's quite a hard thing to do. Try to do it with a cooking apple, which is quite slippery to hold. That is also quite a skill in itself to do. But that's what was done, and it was a sort of a test of masculinity and skill with a knife, that the man of the house had to do that. So, and these things then would be placed at the doorway of a house, again, to ward off evil spirits from coming in. That was the idea behind it. So when the Irish immigrants went across the Atlantic to the Americas in the middle of the 19th century, mainly after the famine, they brought their traditions with them. But turnips were hard to come by, and the Native American pumpkin and the gourd became available, and the Irish immigrants found these were much easier to carve and even more delightful to carve. Because they were so easy to carve, they could be more imaginative and inventive with the types of scary faces that they produced on them, etc. So it's wonderful to see how that tradition that was brought over to America and slightly changed from the pumpkin returning back then to Ireland instead of the turnip as the favoured carving jack-o'-lantern. So again, where does the jack-o'-lantern come from? Well, that's a lovely old story of a man named Jack. We don't know his surname, but the story goes, the folklore, that Jack was quite a trickster and had a great way about him of persuading people to entertain him to drinks in the pub and the tavern, but he himself never repaid the compliment, or rarely repaid it. And word got around of his stinginess and that, and one evening a tall, dark gentleman appeared in the local tavern and got talking to Jack, and then he bought Jack a drink, and Jack had the drink, and then Jack didn't return the compliment. The man got a little bit annoyed with him, and then Jack realized that the man had cloven hooves for feet, and he knew then he was in trouble. So he said to the man, "I'll tell you what, if you can convert yourself into a silver coin here on the counter, I'll buy you a drink." The man said, "Oh, I want more than just your drink. I want your soul." And Jack said, "Agreed." And so the man converted himself in a whiff into a silver coin on the counter, whereupon Jack took the rosary beads out of his pocket and put the crucifix down on top of it and trapped the devil. That's the story. So the devil screamed at him from the coin, and Jack said, "I'll only release you. I'll remove the crucifix when you promise not to take my soul to hell." So the devil agreed. Jack removed the rosary and the crucifix, and the devil reappeared and scampered out the door. About 20 years later, Jack died, and he arrived at the gates of heaven, and St. Peter said, "Oh, Jack, there's such a litany of misdemeanors here against you, we can't possibly let you in." You swindled and you blackguarded everyone. You stole. So Jack had to go down to hell. And at the gates of hell, the devil said, I keep my promises. I'm a gentleman. I can't let you in here. But what I will do is I'll give you a lantern to light your way through the darkness forevermore. That in-between world, that limbo between heaven and hell. And so he threw a turnip at him with a lighted candle inside it. That's where the story comes from. Now, there are variations on that theme of the jack-o'-lantern, but that's that's the main theme, the main story of it. That's where it comes from. So the country is illuminated now with jack-o'-lanterns, and of course in the Irish folklore the jack-o'-lantern was often the spirit of Jack playing mischievous tricks on people, leading them into bogs late at night time when they were on their way home in a drunken stupor. So it's great old fun when you think about all these legends and where they come from and the stories, but this is what entertained people around the fireside when there was no television or any of those technological details and entertainments in the past. So as I say, the jack-o'-lantern has returned to us now, no longer as a turnip but as a pumpkin, and it's wonderful to see, and well, it's one of the more positive aspects of cross-cultural pollination.
As pointed out by Declan, the tradition of wearing masks during Halloween is lifted directly from the Samhain. The creatures of the underworld prepare the world for winter, the harvest having gone, the warmth of the land fading, so it may again return in the spring. But where did these creatures emerge from? What are these places where the veil between worlds thinned and allowed for this crossover? Well, perhaps the most interesting example is Oneghat in County Roscommon. The cave, also known as Uvnagat, the Cave of the Cats, of which Oneghat is an anglicisation, sits upon the site of what was once called Cruachan, now Rathcrogan. Cruachan was once the seat of power for one of the most ancient of Ireland's kingdoms, in this instance, Connacht. Ruled by King Ailill and his no less powerful queen, Maeve, there is a legend regarding these connections in history which rules the legacy of Oneghat and likely has a larger part to play in the very concept of Halloween hauntings. During the 1st century, Ireland was a completely pagan country. It would not be until much later that Christianity was brought to the country, and even then the two faiths lived side by side for many long years, which is how we get the Celtic cross and how and why it differs from the standard Christian version. This is a time of that same filigree and knot, but before the shapes we are used to emerge. This is the Connacht of King Ailill and Queen Maeve, a fearsome and proud kingdom composing most of the west of Ireland. It was during a Samhain, being the night of Harvest End, that a feast was held in Cruachan. While the king and queen dine with their soldiers, 2 men hang from the gallows. After some time drinking and eating, King Ailill rises and proclaims that whoever will tie the corpse with a withe, likely a part of flexile willow branch bound in a knot, he will reward that man that manages to tie them around this man's ankle. In some versions of the story, the reward is a sword with a golden hilt, sure to give status to anyone who wields it strapped to his hip. When he offers this, the warriors are all silent, bar one. Nara. Nara rose and complied with the king's request. Being a lesser warrior of the court, he is likely at this time eager to show his courage, which was the primary virtue in this day and age, or at least that is shown through surviving literature to be the primary virtue. As soon as he tries to tie this willow branch segment around the ankle of this dead man, it snaps off with elastic force, almost resistance. On the 3rd instance, he manages to tie the knot and fasten it around his ankle. Tying the knot is something that will come up again in this story. And as soon as the knot holds, the hanged man flickers back to life. Nara, oh brave Nara, Sling me around your neck and bring me to water. I was awful thirsty when I was hanged. Take us to the house that's nearest us. No doubt shocked, but duty-bound and feeling responsible, Nara hoisted the undead upon his back and lifted him outside. To 3 houses, Nara takes the hanged man until he finally drinks from a washing tub surrounded by a sleeping family in the 3rd home. Without warning, he sprays the water in the faces of each person in the house, killing them instantly. Having had enough of the undead's madness, Nara wordlessly turned with the helpless undead on his back and sprinted back to Cruachan. What met him was not the great clan's feasting hall, but rather a ruin of the place. Fires climbing high, and beside it, a mass of severed heads, those of the men and women he was feasting with just minutes ago. Nara spots a host of armed warriors marching down into a passage deep into the hill and pursues them into the darkness, descending into a sheer, lightless abyss. The warrior emerges into a great chamber where the host kneels before a king. Realizing he's in the presence of something of the other world, Nara stopped in his tracks and addressed the king, asking reason for the slaughter. If he could not prevent or take revenge for what was done, now being surrounded by these armed warriors, he would at least have an answer for why it had to occur, some way to make sense of it. He would not get it. Rather than answering, the king demanded Nara go to a house within the mound, where a woman would welcome him. Doing as asked, Nara nodded and made his way there. And he stays in the other world for some time, 3 days and 3 nights, coming to terms with his new liminal existence in the world of the fairies, also known as the She. Ever on guard, the only person he comes to trust is this woman, who he would take as a wife. Eventually, having seen his character, she chooses to tell him that the She plan to destroy Cruachan. That was not a vision of what was actually occurring, it was a premonition. And she says that the She are holding on to sacred relics, treasures stolen from humankind. And the She intend next Samhain, when the veil is thin again, to leave their mound and rout Cruachan, completely destroying it. She then instructs him how to leave, but tells him that she is pregnant with child. With his head understandably spinning, Nara departs the She for a moment, returns to True Cruachan, where not a moment has passed, despite having been gone in his mind for 3 days and 3 nights. The different passaging of time between the lands of the She, the other world, and the lands of man is a very common motif in mythology from this era. He is given the golden hilted sword, and he explains himself and his adventures, and it takes some effort to convince Ailill and Maeve, but when he produces a piece of wild garlic that was grown in the other world by the She, they choose to believe him. So he demands the mound be sealed. So they summon a champion, Fergus MacRugh, and it is sealed. But right before it's closed, Nara dives down into the passageway, never to be seen again, giving up the status of the golden hilted sword. Whether he survived the second passage or not is not for mortals to know. One thing we do know is that eventually Cruachan, now Rathcrogan, faded from glory. Today, it is an archaeological site. Its influence waned in history due to strains upon the lands of the time. One may wonder if, in the long run, the fairies had their way of it, but the brave Nara may still be in that other world, resplendent with treasures and family. There are many people in Ireland who would tell me that I am making a mistake in speaking about these things. Clans of natives in the Americas have their own things of which they do not speak, such as skinwalkers or wendigos. A non-Irish person may hear the word fairy and anticipate to hear me speak of Tinkerbell, of granted wishes, or romance and mischief. But fairy is a complicated and misunderstood term. In English, the word gift means a present, but in German, it is a word for poison. This is how I have always seen the term fairy, and to a lot of people, it is a misnomer. In order to explain what I mean, we will be speaking about the foundational myth of Ireland, the Laur Gavala Éireann, the Book of Invasions, but also about the modern view on things. Before we begin in earnest, I want to set a few poles of guidance. Firstly, fairy is not a species, it is a status. Secondly, the resting place of a fairy is critical to understanding them. And third, while they are inherently magical, they are not that in a way a mortal can understand. And finally, fairies are contextual beings. In some stories they will be hostile and terrifying, and in another they may be generous and gorgeous. As a foreword on the existence of modern fairy belief in Ireland, here is an anecdote from Dr. Declan Downey.
Which reminds me of a wonderful story from the late 1960s, early 70s, when there were major changes to Irish agriculture. And then, of course, we joined the European Economic Community in 1971-72. And that's when you had a lot of investment coming into Irish farming, with the building of new milking parlours and barns, etc., for cattle. All very, very modern. And there was a Dutch film crew that were in West Limerick. I won't mention the place. The people are still there. But they were filming a number of farms, and farmers doing a documentary on how the Irish farmers were coping with the new changes, you see, and all of that, and the investment into farming, and how they were developing their farms while at the same time respectful of traditions. And they were in this farm, anyhow, say in West Limerick, and they noticed that the old stall, the old wooden stall with the thatched roof on it, and inside the door you had the St. Bridget's cross. Again, she's the patroness of all cattle and farm animals. And the rowan, the sprig of the rowan tree, branch of the rowan tree, I should say. And the rowans, of course, were also to ward off evil spirits and witches, etc. So they noticed that over the old barn. And then they went into the new milking parlour, and they saw the St. Bridget's cross and the rowan branch in the new parlour as well. So they asked the farmer why was this tradition being kept, and he spoke to them about it and what they meant, etc. And one of the Dutch interviewers said, "But surely you don't believe in these things." "Oh, of course I don't believe in them, but they're there."
As I stated in the beginning, fairies are a difficult thing to pin down, in more sense than just one. To open a proper explanation, I will ask a question. What does a god look like when the land has grown around it? When the dominion of a deity is surrendered and the land overruns its will? The Tuatha De Danann, often shortened to the Tuatha, are a pre-human, human-like race whose name translates to the tribe of the gods. Written of them in the Leabhar Gabhála Éireann is that the truth was not known beneath the sky of stars whether they were of heaven or of earth. They came down upon mountains from dark clouds and spread their influence through vast knowledge of architecture, the arts, and magic. While boasting this incredible power, they mostly preferred to indulge in the arts when left well enough alone, which, naturally, did not last forever. A group of humans arrived by sea and ship, and were met by three Tuatha goddesses, Eru, whose namesake later became Éireann, the Irish name for Ireland, Banba, and Fodla, who asked that the island be named after them. Of course, we know that occurred. When their husbands arrived, each a Tuatha king, they managed to get the humans to agree on a truce. For 3 days, the humans would anchor 9 waves' distance from the land. No sooner than did the humans comply, the Tuatha summoned a storm to keep them at bay, winds blowing them back out to sea. Amerigan, a poet aboard the human vessel, soothed the storm with a song, so the humans landed it and defeated the Tuatha. With respect in their defeat, the Tuatha De Danann surrendered, and the land of Ireland was split in two, above and below, material world and other world. The Tuatha were brought to burial mounds called Sídhe and laid there, not dead, not gone, but alive and eternal in the other world. Eventually, the Tuatha De Danann changed into the Aes Sídhe as a result of this, the folk of the Sídhe, the burial mounds. It is sometimes translated to incorporate the story's connotations as the hidden folk, or the fair folk, or the good people. It is from the word Sídhe that we get banshee, for example, which is a type of fairy. This brings up the other element of fairies. They are not just otherworldly deities changed by their absence from the material plane. They are also myriad, manifold, and in all different shapes and sizes. Having been a people of the art in their time upon the material land of Ireland, it is not surprising then that they are no less universally motivated as the Aes Sídhe, and all individual. There are commonalities in the behaviour of the Aes Sídhe, however. For example, the Aes Sídhe lack a sense of morality in a way that we understand it. Instead, for them, morality is replaced by a type of reciprocity, exchange. You may find yourself alone in the woods at night and encounter a person behaving completely normally. But if you cough in their presence and do not immediately apologise, the Aes Sídhe will reveal themselves and take what they feel is owed in kind. It is difficult to mention the significance of fairies without mentioning that of their domiciles, the fairy forts, or the associated structures such as fairy trees. Fairy forts are usually found in fields between the size of a car or a small house, marked by a circular earthen bank or depression in the ground. It is said that the Aes Sídhe guard these, and some who step into them report feelings of derealization, lightheadedness, or fatigue. To interfere with or destroy a fairy structure is considered a grave error, and even in the current day, all misfortune which befalls an interfering party will be treated almost as karma. Like Declan's anecdote in the beginning suggested, the fairies are respected to this day, even if people are sheepish to admit that they put any stock in such beliefs.
As for the fairies, well, that's the English word, fairies, but in Irish, they were never called anything like that. In the Irish, they're known as the Sídhe, S-I-D-H-E. And the Sídhe can be translated from the Old Irish into phrases like the lordly ones, or the good ones, or the special ones. They were never derogatively referred to. They were always referred to with respect. Even the ones that were malevolent had to be treated with respect. So fairy is an English word, and it comes from the German die Feen. Die Feen refers to, again, this sort of spiritual people that live in ancient forests and mountains and etc. So, words like elves and gnomes, that they all come from a Germanic Scandinavian tradition, and even then the elf-like peoples, that's transliterated then into English as the fairies, and then it's used here in English in Ireland to refer to the Sídhe, but that's actually incorrect. We talk about fairy forts and that, but that's a 19th century English name for them. The Irish always refer to them as the Sídhe, or the lordly ones, or the kindly ones, or the good ones, the Eumenides in Greek. So these are spiritual beings. Now, again, going back into the tradition of the mythology, they are supposed to be the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, or Diana, the goddess of the moon, of hunting, Artemis in Greek. So they would have come from Sídhe in the Greek world many millennia ago, here to Ireland. This was the idea. Then when the Milesians, the Celts, arrived under Amergin, and they tried to take the country, it was through poetic battle in poetry between Amergin and the Tuatha De Danann, and Amergin's poem won. And the Dawn agreed then that they would be the rulers of the realm under the ground, and the Milesians, Celts, would rule over the ground. So that's where that comes from. So again, we need to be careful about these things and not to get them mixed up with so many other cultures, because they're quite different. And that so we have our own she or lordly ones, or Tuatha Danann, if you like. And these are the people or the beings that our ancestors were very careful about, not to annoy them, not to disturb them, etc. So we need to bear that in mind as well with regards to connection with the other world. So again, people were often asked the story in stories, how did these people come into being? Why are they not with God? Why are they not with the devil? And of course, there are lots of stories connected with that in folklore, where priests would often be accosted on the road at night by the she, and they would be asked, "Who will we be with on Judgment Day?" And the priests would often have to be careful, not to annoy them, so they would give an ambiguous answer. So there was a certain ambiguity about the she. Are they evil spirits, or are they good spirits, or are they somewhat indeterminate in between? Now, some parts of folk tradition say that they are the fallen angels, those that fell with Lucifer from heaven. But the fallen angels went straight to hell. They didn't go into an intermediate term. But as I say, these are all the little things that are thrown up in the folklore, and that so. As I say, it's they're an indeterminate grouping, and so that is why people have to be respectful of them. So that's why we have the Sceach, that forlorn white-thorn tree in the middle of a field that's never touched, or the ring forts, the old ancient ring forts, which are covered with white-thorn trees or ash trees, some oak, etc., and they're never touched. People are aware of them and aware of their significance, and there is still a deep-rooted sense about the existence of these beings. So, as I say, people have an ambiguous belief. They like to pretend they're not superstitious, that they're modern, that they're with it, but at the same time, they're not going to tempt things either. Tempting fate is always a dangerous thing. And one thing is for certain, when it comes to hedging their bets, Irish people have always been very good at it. As there's an old expression said of Kerry people, and it's also the very same expression in Spain of people from Galicia, the Gallego. These are the Celts of northern Spain. That if you meet a Kerry man or a Gallego on a staircase, you'll never know whether he's coming up or going down.
It is easy to lose sight of the fact that the Aes She, the most common type of fairy, are a warped and defeated form of God. Diminished divinity, given freely in surrender. A distorted slant of light, who respected their defeat. Few other pantheons echo the Tuatha story. It is difficult to imagine the entire Greek pantheon, for instance, submitting to deposition. However, the Aes She are only one type of fairy, and there are many. Some are categories like the previously mentioned Banshee, a figure which likely needs no introduction, and there are several individuals that are noteworthy within that category. However, there is one story of an individual fairy that is of note, one which is suspected to be the true inspiration for Dublin-born writer Bram Stoker's seminal work, the novel Dracula. Sometime in the 5th or 6th century, in the County Derry town of Slatavery, there was a chieftain named Avertak or Auertak. The ancient Irish had a conception of wholeness that is not so much seen in the modern day. If one lost a limb in battle, they were seen as less than a man or woman. To be missing a part of oneself was to be incomplete. While this stance is incompatible with a modern worldview, It is important to this story. One must remember that in ancient times, life was short and hard, and to be missing a limb or diminished in some other way created real difficulties for both the self and the society around them in ways that we have the learning and technology to get around in today's day and age. We may choose to be merciful upon them in hopes future generations will bestow the same benefit of the doubt unto us. The reason I feel the need to clarify this is that our text's very name translates very literally from Irish to dwarf, so a short stature is implied, and depending on how you read the story, key to this. It is possible that the local peoples of the area gave Auertach this name after the events of the legend in an ironic twist, but given another fact I'll reveal later, that seems unlikely. Auertach's reign was notably cruel. His lands bordered that of another chieftain, Cahan, whose name and clan serve as the basis for the modern surnames of O'Kane, Kane, and Keen. There is an implication of rivalry between them in the legend, and it is perhaps jealousy that jilted the rule of Auertach over his subjects. Another interesting note is that his name also suggests a lack of respect from his people. A chieftain's job is to resolve disputes and oversee his land like any other warlord or king in early history. And for Auertach, this was likely a thankless job. And it is kind of because of this sort of lack of fair play and this social exchange, this social contract, that he is regarded as a fairy in nature because he chooses to take something else in this story. There is a dispute over exactly how, whether by the hand of Cahan, the rival, or by falling from a high place. But Auertach is somehow killed and receives the burial of a king. The body is laid out upright and standing in its tomb as opposed to horizontally. However, the next day, Auertach is reseated upon his throne. In early modern versions, he then demands a bowl of blood from the wrists of each member of his kingdom. This detail, while absent in the eldest version of the tale, is notable, and I will bring up more differences that occur with the early modern versus original or eldest known retellings as they come up later. Horrified that the tyrant had returned, Auertach's people stormed into Cahan's land, begging him to free them of the dwarf once more. Cahan returns in armor and slays him in combat. So you can imagine Cahan's surprise when the next day the denizens of the neighboring kingdom are asking him to grant Auertach his third death. The detail of the story varies here again. In early modern versions, Cahan seeks a local saint, but in the oldest tales, it is a druid he goes to for aid. Either way, he is told that Auertach is no longer a human being, whether he has been possessed or replaced by a fairy or struck a bargain with one or become something else. Most commonly, he is regarded as some sort of fairy. Maybe he always was one. At the druid's advice, Cahan returns to Auertach's hold and pierces his heart with a wooden sword carved from a yew branch, leaving it in his body. He then buries him upside down to face the other world and plants thorned vegetation to ensure that Auertach would be barred by roots if he somehow made it past the previous defenses. Finally, the grave was covered by a very large stone. Now, here's what makes me think Auertach's name was not ironic. His grave is known today as the Giant's Grave, and that is possibly the pinnacle of dry Irish sarcasm. I have lived all 26 years of my life in this country, and I know when my fellow countrymen are making fun of an incredibly traumatic and perspective-shaking cultural event, so they can all laugh about it over a few drinks and go to sleep that night. Thank you for joining me by the bonfire again. Between gods altered by shattered dimensions and a fairy vampire meeting his demise at the hands of a great warlord, I think we've laid out a good foundation of what the word fairy truly represents in Ireland. More stories of the fairies will emerge. Most Irish mythological creatures who are said to encounter humans come from this category of understanding. If you happen across a beautiful stranger this winter, don't ask anything from them. Apologize if you cough or sneeze. Be polite and careful with your words. Respect goes a long way in Ireland. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Witch, warlock, wise woman, healer, all these titles mean something. Folk hero or heretic. Across the history of Ireland, men and women were believed to be capable of holding the power to protect or destroy, going all the way back to the time of the Druids of old. A wise woman may cure the ill and ailing with herbs, have a certain insight into dealing with newborn children, or the wisdom to nudge a family back into the community after suffering ostracization. But human history also tells us that exceptional people, when misunderstood, are often blamed for the issues of the times. Should misfortune befall a rural community, it is often these wise ones who are doled out the blame. He did this with that power of his. I never should have trusted a seventh son. This is her doing. It's her fault the baby died. She was the last to hold him. Gossip, particularly in rural communities, served as both warning and judgment. It's likely an artifact of the rural form of life that has not quite been uprooted from the culture in the modern day. This creates a form of quiet, solitary judgment in us, typically paired with a lack of action if these judgments prove individual and internal, but not always. And so, when the collective makes up its mind about these things, the line between healer and heretic becomes thinner than the boundary between worlds on the Samhain could ever hope to. Belief was, and for many still is, a language of survival. In a climate of harsh winters, temperamental weather, and notoriously fragile harvests, fear does not die easy, and notions of witches arise often, both as wards and warnings, and fear is a powerful motivator indeed. Even so, there is awe. A cunning woman who heals a child, cures a herd of cow or sheep from illness, or is perceived to guard a place against forces unseen, was often revered. To some, this creates a folk hero, and to others, a threat to power which must be outwitted, avoided, or prosecuted. Witch, warlock, wise woman, healer. Even here at the campfire, every title holds weight, every tale carries fear, every whisper belays at least a little truth. In Ireland, superstition was not fiction, but a mechanism for the persistence of humanity. And so it's here that we begin to understand the truth behind our tales and legends, walking in the shadows of witches.
The question often arises, what did people do in Ireland long ago when there were very few priests available? And this is a question that comes back again in the present day with the shortage of clergy and the decline of the official institutional church in Ireland. And this brings us to the topic of the Farfasa or the Banfasa, the wise man or the wise woman. In Ireland, we never had witchcraft or witches or warlocks in the English sense or the continental European sense or indeed the North American Puritan England sense, New England. We instead had these people who were acknowledged as being wise in the ways of nature and in the spirit world. They weren't necessarily evil people. Very often they were good people, wise people, and were acknowledged as such. And under the Brehon laws, they had a special status. They were part of the Eas Dóna. They had a certain aristocratic status, if you like the smiths, blacksmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, anyone involved in smithy work. They were regarded as having certain magical powers as well. Maybe magical isn't quite the word we should use, but they had certain powers that were supernatural. And that so they were craftspeople, they were people of knowledge, they were people who understood things, and very often they were consulted. And we can see a return to that pattern now again. People going to people who have still kept alive old ways. So in terms of Halloween as we see it now, you often see the image of a witch on a broomstick with her pointed hat and her black cat on the broomstick beside her, and that sort of thing. So let's just discuss this question of witchcraft in Ireland. So as I've said, we didn't have the continental European or English or New England Puritan sense of witchcraft. We never associated our wise men or wise women with being practitioners of Satanism, black magic, satanic masses, that type of thing. It does not exist in the Irish tradition. And on this point, I would like to draw your attention to as well another myth that's abroad, that the Spanish Inquisition had persecuted witches. No, it did not, because under Spanish law and Inquisition law, witchcraft did not exist. It was classified as a harmless superstition. So, likewise in Ireland, it did not exist as such, except it's in 1586. This is in the very late 16th century, after the defeat of the Desmond Rebellion, at the time when the plantation of Munster was taking place, the Elizabethan plantation of Munster. And you have the arrival of English Calvinists coming into Ireland and bringing with them that very puritanical Protestantism with them. It's in 1586 that you have the first Witchcraft Act passed in the Irish Parliament. All through the Middle Ages, from the arrival of the Normans right through, you never any statutes on the Irish statute book against witchcraft. You even have the story of the great Earl of Desmond, Gerald the Third Earl, the Wizard Earl, the Poet Earl, and how he was interested in the occult arts and shape-shifting, and performed shape-shifting in his castle at Loughgar to entertain his countess, and then a cat suddenly appeared when he was in the shape of a bird, and she screamed, and he vanished, and appears every 7 years on his great horse riding the shores of Loughgar until the silver hooves of his horse wear out. That's the legend. It's a great legend.
It's not so difficult to imagine a house in the heart of the village, as though the township grew around it. A small cottage, a source of sanctuary and suspicion where the wise woman dwells. The widow in there sings songs nobody else remembers to ailing children, tending to them and the anxious family who believe this hardship to be a sign of rejection from the spirits of the land and sky. To some, this figure will become a lifeline, a necessity in cold winters. Her herbs calm fevers, her songs lull children to sleep. She brews her remedies, readily provided by the village. When a child is ill in a rural community, everyone has a stake in it. Any herbs she asked for would be given freely. But trust, so hard to gain, so easy to lose. If the harvest fails despite the woman's blessings, whispers will begin quickly. She has too much power. Some wise folk were accused of tampering with the weather, summoning hail, frost, or storms to kill livestock and botch crops. More supernatural stories mention shape-shifting, with a notorious association with the Hare. The Hare, as discussed earlier in this series, was believed to be a vessel for fairy women to traverse our world. If someone had a suspicion a wise woman was secretly a fairy, it could explain her attunement to the land, but also a secret, hidden malice. Paranoia breeds fast in rural communities, especially when others vie for similar positions of influence. Communities relied on the insight of these wise folk, however. It did not always end in death or burning. And yet, there are instances in which that's exactly what came to pass.
Witchcraft as such did not exist on the Irish statute book until 1586, and it wasn't until 1821 that was repealed. So it's a very short period. But in that period, almost 125 to 200 years afterwards, there were 4 major witchcraft trials in Ireland. Now, someone would say to me, what about Dame Alice Kettler in Kilkenny, the famous witchcraft trial of 1320 to 24? Yes, there was a trial, but it wasn't conducted under the law of the land. That was conducted under ecclesiastical law by the Bishop of Ossory, Bishop de Ladrede, who was an Englishman. He wasn't an Irishman. He was an Englishman, an English Franciscan. He had arrived in Kilkenny there at the beginning of the 14th century. And he came up against Dame Alice Kettler and a powerful group of people in Kilkenny itself, the bourgeoisie and the nobility. And Dame Alice was an independent-minded woman. She had 4 husbands. It just so happened that they died within a short space of time of marriage, and there were suspicions about her accumulating wealth, etc., and that she had practiced witchcraft. But the interesting thing there is it was the Dame Alice's brother-in-law from her first marriage, Roger Outlaw. He was the Justiciar of Ireland. He was the one who helped her to escape from Kilkenny. She wasn't burnt at the stake. And he was the one who took action against the bishop for conducting a witch trial under church law instead of handing it over to the law of the land. But of course, the law of the land at the time didn't provide for it. So it had to be a church trial. The bishop overstepped himself by seeking a death sentence. Exile would have been preferable. So that brought the bishop up into conflict with the Justiciar of Ireland, Roger Outlaw. So anyhow, that's just a byway. And then, of course, there was the other famous trial of a witch in 1432. That was the prioress of the convent of St. Catherine de O'Gonil, or the known in Irish as Monastery na Gaillimh Dubh in Shannagolden, Old Abbey. Now, again, that wasn't a trial under secular law of the state, it was a church trial. And it was authorised by Pope Martin IV on complaints about the prioress, that she had bewitched a group of local young men and had brought them into her convent. And as the trial record said, they were her stable of stallions. You can make of that what you want, but all the other nuns left in disgust from the convent, and they apparently there was great debauchery that went on there. The other nuns had left, as I said, and complained about their prioress, and the Earl of Desmond took the matter in hand, as the convent was on Desmond land, and he had the Bishop of Limerick at the time conduct an inquisition. But the inquisition found that she wasn't guilty of witchcraft, but she was guilty of debauchery and breaking her vows as a nun, and she was ordered to be confined to her cell. And it was in 1432 that the convent was closed. The lands were given over to the Earl of Desmond, of course, and the Cailleach Dubh, the nun herself, the prioress, she remained immured in a cell, but she still dispensed wisdom about cures, etc., to the locals. They used to come to her window and communicate with her and bring her food and drink and everything, and she'd hand out her chamber pot and they'd empty it for her, that type of thing. So that is the legend there in Monastery na Gaillimh Dubh. But even the word Cailleach or Cailleach, it doesn't necessarily mean a hag or a witch. Now we have the story of the old hag of Bear and all of that type of thing, the Cailleach. In ancient Celtic mythology, the Cailleach, this hag-like figure with magical powers. No, Cailleach can mean a very wise woman, someone who understands nature and cures particularly, etc. Someone who can foretell the weather because of the signs in nature as well. It's basic physics. And it also means a nun, because in Old Irish, nuns were not called Manor Rialta, as they are now. They were called na Cailleacha. And Cailleacha Dubh, it was because they wore a black habit. They were Augustinian nuns. So they had a black habit and a black veil. So they were the canonesses of St. Augustine, by the way. So they weren't just mere nuns, they were canonesses. And as a certain Spanish nobleman in the 17th century remarked of a group of Irish canonesses of St. Augustine from Killone in County Clare and St. Peter's Cell in Limerick, who had been exiled from Ireland and ended up in Madrid, he referred to them as more like countesses of St. Augustine than canonesses because of their lifestyle, and that. But that's another story again. It's quite entertaining. They introduced poitín to Madrid as a medicine, and it was the prior of the Knights of Calatrava who was supporting them in a house in Madrid, and he was complaining about all the expenses incurred in maintaining them. So anyhow, if we go to the Irish Witchcraft Act then of 1586, following on from that act, there were actually 4 state witch trials in Ireland. The first was in 1655. Interestingly, it's almost 80 years after the Witchcraft Act was passed. So, and that was of a Marion Fisher in Carrickfergus in County Antrim, and she was a member of the Presbyterian community there. The second one was 5 years later in 1660 at Youghal in County Cork, the trial of Florence Newton. And in 1698 then you have a third one in Antrim again, and then the 1711 on Island Magee, up there in Northern Ireland too, in Antrim, where you had the deaths of Anne Haltridge and Mary Dunbar. And it was a group of women who didn't attend the local Presbyterian church and spent their time smoking and drinking and carrying on with a William Seller. And they were all put on trial. Now, we don't know for certain what happened at the end of the trial, because the trial records break off. There's no statement as to whether they were executed or not. We just know they were put on trial. But in all these cases, all of them involved members of the Presbyterian community. Now, the Presbyterians are a very Calvinistic, very puritanical group of Protestants, very fundamentalist, and it is interesting that these were the women who and one man who were put on trial for witchcraft, and it's comparable to the New Salem witch trials over there in New England in the 17th century as well. The Salem witch trials, people will be familiar with that from history as well. So then the next time we have an actual trial, it's not for witchcraft, but it is for murder. And the verdict returned was manslaughter. But it involved the accusation made against the deceased for being a witch or a changeling. And that was in Feathered in County Tipperary in 1895, the famous or infamous burning of Bridget Cleary. Now, Bridget Cleary was a seamstress, and a very good seamstress by all accounts. She had a profitable business, and she was married, but the marriage didn't bring any children. And this was obviously a source of annoyance to her husband and also to her father. And Bridget had become ill. It was diagnosed as bronchitis at the time. But her husband, it was in March of that year she became ill, and then by the 15th of March, she ended up being doused with paraffin by her husband and burned. And he claimed to the authorities that she had become a changeling, that she had gone away with the fairies, etc. But her remains were found in a search. It was the dog, her own dog, that led the police to where her bones, where her charred remains were. And that so the husband and her father were put on trial, but the jury delivered a verdict of manslaughter by reason of insanity. But they got 15 years in prison. But poor Bridget Cleary was disowned even in death by her own family, and she had to be buried in a pauper's grave and feathered. So those are those are the basic outline of trials involving witchcraft in Ireland. And as you can see, it's a case of being associated with the Scottish or English Presbyterian settlers in Ireland, rather than coming within the Gaelic tradition or the Hiberno-Norman traditions as such. So that's by way of explanation of witchcraft in Ireland. But in terms of that, in the old Irish tradition, let's say we had this tradition of the Farfassa or the Banfassa, being well aware of the workings of nature and also the workings of the spirit world and how to deal with them. And in that context also, yes, there are certain people who are wise in these ways, but also malevolent. And these are the people who practice pishogues, the planting of rotten eggs in hay, or disposing of a dead calf in another person's property. These would be the two most widely known methods of pishoguery. And then the third one, which is less well known, but is something to look out for, the planting of ash twigs smeared with unsalted butter. Anything with salt in it is purified, and nothing evil can dwell within it. That's why we use salt with holy water, for instance, etc. It's in the ritual of consecrating holy water. And also in the ritual of baptism, the child is given salt on their tongue as well as a means of exorcism. So the unsalted butter is smeared on the ash twigs, and they're planted inside the boundary then of the person's property who is the victim of the curse. So very often in these cases, when they're discovered, usually the family experience terrible misfortunes one after the other, the cattle dying, etc., crops failing, bad harvests, misfortunes within the family. And I know personally of 3 instances of pishogues on people where the priest had to be called, and the implements of the curse, if you like, whether it was the rotten eggs or the hay and the dead calf or the twigs, had to be gathered up, and they had to be brought to a crossroads and burnt, or disposed of. Now, why a crossroads? Because there the evil couldn't go on anyone. Another way of dealing with it was to let them off in a river. Now, of course, you'd be polluting the river if you put a dead calf into it, and that. So, but the thing is that they had to be disposed of, and the preferable way of disposing of them, the one I witnessed, was by burning. So that was what was going on, and very often the people who practiced the pishogues they themselves could never swallow Holy Communion. And there was an incident involving that too in a church that I know of, where a certain person couldn't swallow the communion, nearly choked. But anyhow, as I say, these are the things. And another strange thing was very often the person who practices Pishogues is related to a very holy person, could be in the consecrated religious life. So that mirrors the old spiritual idea that where you have goodness and sanctity, you will also have evil trying to creep its way in. So that's a thing we always have to remember when we hear about, scandals in the church, and that there's an old saying that where Christ has his church, Satan has his side chapel. So these things go hand in hand, evil always trying to creep in where there's goodness. So ultimately, as I say, that's where the whole tradition of the witch comes from at Halloween. It's more an application from the English puritanical tradition of witches on Halloween. In the Irish tradition, we didn't have them. We just had the wise women and the wise men. That's where that comes from.
Thank you for joining me by the campfire again. I would like to thank frequent collaborator of the show, Dr. Declan Downey of UCD, for his contributions again. This show would be smaller without him. Warnings, hopes, accusations, blessings, curses, burnings, a vocabulary for the unseen powers that shaped life in Ireland. Communities living within a cocktail of reverence and suspicion, living on to tell tales of men and women whose knowledge could save or could damn. Today, the long shadow of Ireland's witches has shrunken significantly. There is still an archetypical respect given to the wise elder women of this country, but the association of magic and paranoia has mostly perished. It is said that history does not repeat, but it does like to rhyme. If you listen to the world around you, you'll hear fragments of memories, the echoes of these lives from before our time. You won't hear storms shaped by malignant women or of bubbling cauldrons full of cure-all concoctions, but rather you'll hear the stories of community that refuse to die. Rightfully so. Memory is the only true form of immortality available to us. Speak of warlocks, speak of wise women, and speak of healers. Tell a tale of witches and the shadows they cast. Neil, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Sorry. Oh, that's got off to a great start.
Two bundles of nerves here in the recording studio. It's the fanciest place I've been in a long time.
I'm so worried I'm going to break something or just going to spill tea, or then I'll be bankrupt for life.
We'll split the bill, don't worry. We'll both be bankrupt.
Okay, that's recorded now. That is admitted in evidence.
Neil, how are you doing? Would you like to properly introduce yourself without me talking over you?
Sure. My name is Neil Sharpson. I'm a writer, author, blogger, podcaster, general ne'er-do-well living in Dublin.
Notably, writer of some Irish mythological kind of folklore horror books as well.
Yeah.
The two I know of, you can tell me if there's more. I haven't read Don't Trust Fish. There could be a big twist.
There is a big twist in Don't Trust Fish.
The Burial Tide and Knock Knock Open Wide.
Mm-hmm.
First question I'd like to ask you is, I'm going to focus on the Burial Tide first. You said it in Kerry, which is where I'm from, so that naturally drew my interest.
Mm-hmm.
I told you on the phone that the scariest part was seeing the word Tralee written down on paper, you know?
What's wrong with Tralee? Tralee is gorgeous.
Tralee's gorgeous to visit, you know? No, Tralee's lovely. I've worked in Tralee all my life. But there's a certain kind of comfort in living in, you know, in a lot of people's eyes, the ass crack of the world, you know? And then, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you're reading a horror book you know, and you know it's set in Ireland, and then you see it set right there, and you're like, oh gosh, I already knew no help was coming. You know, now this is worse. There's something.
I feel an intense guilt. Kerry is one of my favorite places on this planet. I've spent so many of my summers down there with my family, and then to write this book set in a community in Kerry where everyone is just this horrible. I apologize. I'm this. Just like fucking Jackeen's. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, you're allowed to swear. Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic. Oh well, then I'm gonna make.
Oh, let it loose. Let it loose. Let it loose.
So, it was written with all the love and affection in the world.
Oh no, you can absolutely tell in the story, like in a lot of the characters. My sister is actually named Grania, and it's quite accurate. But what I wanted to ask you was kind of like, you know, you can forgive me for not knowing off the top of my head, but I assume Knock Knock Open Wide is set somewhere else in the country. Is that correct?
So Knock Knock is set in Dublin principally. There's a lot of it takes place in Scarna in County Wexford.
Oh, cool. What drew you, because you did one in Dublin and Wexford, like you said. So then what drew you from that towards Kerry? You know, and specifically because, you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but the impression I got of the island and Ballydon was that it was very much like a Blasket Islands kind of fictionalized sort of.
Well, yeah. So I mean,
or Skellig.
Well, it was kind of, it's set. So it's actually in the world. This was kind of like had to be cut from the book. There was a lot of kind of like supplementary material. Like I had a Wikipedia page written for Inishbannock.
Oh wow!
And like newspaper cuttings and a report from the Irish Folklore Commission about a collector going down there and uncovering weird things about Inishbannock and then mysteriously going missing and all that kind of stuff. And that had to be kind of cut for time. But my original concept for Inishbannock is that it is part of an archipelago that included the Blasket Islands, but that's now kind of like there was volcanic activity, and now it's kind of like there's only the center of the archipelago was flooded, and now there's only kind of like Inishbannock on one end and the Blaskets on the other. Obviously, like the Blaskets, the Blaskets is still uninhabited, I believe. I know is there like a couple living there.
I want to say there's 4 people living there, and that sounds like a number I'm pulling off the top of my head, but I actually believe it is 4 because I went to the Wikipedia page recently. I think there's like just a couple of people who are mostly doing what's the word? Like geological and science people.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. So it's kind of, so obviously Inishbannock is a lot bigger than that, and it has a community. It's I forget the number. I think it's got around like 2,000 people living on it. So it's much, in that sense, it's much more based on Inishmore. But I mean, just in terms of the landscape and the kind of like the atmosphere, it's just like I say, I spent so much time in that part of the world, and it's you know, it still feels like coming home, if that's not presumptuous to say.
Not at all.
So it's kind of like, yeah, it was just, I just felt that that was like such a perfect setting for this kind of like story about a remote kind of like island community, and that's why I set it there. Yeah.
Was there, even beyond the sort of Blasket part, was there like something about is there something specific to Kerry? Because I feel like you're in this place, and I feel like a lot of tourists, especially, I had some American friends over last year, and they found this immediately, which was they landed here in Dublin, and we kind of journeyed down the country, and then as you kind of get to there, you know, they had this sort of feeling of like it's just a feeling of kind of pastorality, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not being cut off in a bad way.
No.
But there is a sense of being left to your own devices.
Yes.
And that can be, in a horror setting especially, that can be quite isolating.
Yeah.
And setting on an island as well, I might be presumptuous, but I see that as intentionality.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like there's descriptions on the island of like Mara walking across the island at night, and just like the silence and the darkness and just the feeling that you're just like the only living being in the entire world. And that was very much drawn from just like nights in Kerry, just kind of like walking down country roads in the 80s without any high-vis jackets. Somehow we survived. But yeah, it's just there is a different field. It's a different land almost.
Yeah.
It's I think there are still kind of like kingdoms in Ireland. There are still different realms. It's not just one big homogenous mass. It's a world unto itself.
Absolutely, especially in Kerry, you see that in the county finals all the time. You know, I want to ask you more specifically about the creation of Ballydon as a town and a settlement. But you mentioned something really interesting there, which was the supplemental materials. That's really cool. There's something very like ARG sort of like noir horror about that.
Yeah.
What was the reason for cutting them? Did they just not fit, or was it kind of a thing of like, this is a story engine that is not going to be followed up on as the story goes on?
I think it was just it was like what the editors felt was the note I kept getting back is that it needed to be more horror. So like the earlier drafts, it was kind of like, obviously it opens with quite like with a very horrific scene, which is Mara waking up buried literally underground in a coffin. But when she gets out, it's more of a mystery story until around until around the halfway point. And what they were kind of like, and I think they were right on balance, was that they were kind of like, this is a horror story, and we need to kind of like be feeling the menace and the tension and that pressure, kind of like, so I basically, I had to, like, I love world building. I love kind of like that whole the supplementary kind of like filling out the details of the kind of like of the world you created. I love that part, but you can get bogged down in that
very much.
And I think that was one of the criticisms of Knock Knock Open Wide, which was my first horror novel, that a lot of people took issue with, was that there are long stretches of that horror novel that aren't a horror novel. That's just focusing on these two women falling in love in UCD in the early 2000s, and where the whole kind of like the supernatural element, the horror novel, are just put to the background. And I felt that was very, very important for that story, and if I had to go back, I would do it the same way. But it is also true that you gotta give the people what they came for, and if they pick 100%. Up a horror novel, it has to feel like a horror novel.
Yeah, there's definitely, especially with horror, because horror is, because it's sort of it is a genre that has subgenres within it. I can see why that kind of, you have to prioritize some things over others, because I feel like, especially in the writing process as well, and like you said, with world building and all that, it's kind of easy to get lost. Very interesting though. I'd love to see you tackle something like that in the future, that kind of a format of things.
Yeah, I have. Well, then I have an idea that I think you will really like, but that'll be a few years down the line.
We'll talk. Hey, same time, same regular channel. On that subject of horror, I wanted to ask you, because there's, you go back to just before like the 1916 Rising and stuff like that. You have like Lady Gregory, W.B. Yeats, all these other people. I'll forget to mention 100 million names and I'll feel bad later, so I'll just stop at those two. You have all of these people doing, this sort of like cultural renaissance, where it's like, you have, the stories of Cuchulainn being told, you have the Children of Lear being told 7,000 times, and you have all these kind of, the myths being reinterpreted on that scale again. And I think that your books prove there's an appetite for that again, which is wonderful to see. But
I don't think it ever went away.
I don't think it did either. I think that like there's been a lot of great books, like I forget that author, but the fellow who wrote The Call as well.
Shine?
That's him, exactly, yeah. There's always been an appetite for these kind of things. I think it's easier to get eyes on them in the modern age, because you have, like, I found your book through Reddit, like I told you outside. But what I wanted to ask you is, there is, even internationally recognized, a very distinct subgenre of horror in itself, which is Irish horror. There is, especially when it's, comes to things like The Call and your books, where it has a mythological or kind of a folkloric bent to it. What do you think that sort of story offers that you can't really get outside of that, And that's a broad question by all means. So
that's it. Well, I think it's, first of all, it's like I am always kind of like baffled at how underexposed and unseen Irish mythology is compared to Norse, Greek, Roman, and of course there are many and varied historical and cultural factors for why that is. But it seems like at the same time you're like, there is so much good stuff here that's just being left on the table.
Yeah.
So when you have, but that also can like that. So when you're kind of like, there is an appetite building. I've seen so many people like commenting, it's like Irish folklore I'm in.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like it's at that nice sweet spot where there's kind of like there's definitely an awareness building of it now and an interest and a hunger for it, but it's also still very, very untapped. It's like there is an oil reserve there that we're just kind of like, that's going to keep that enough for like 500 years. I probably should use a more ecologically friendly metaphor, but anyway. The wind, there is 500 years worth of wind there. But yeah, it's just, I think we're starting to see the momentum of something very, very big building in terms of Irish folk horror.
So you think we're in kind of another one of those periods where it's all gonna blossom at once?
I hope so.
Yeah, me too.
I have bills to pay. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to manifest it here.
The burial tide on Kindle and in stores. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about Ballydon. I'm going to circle back around to that, which is the specific set, the town within Inishbanack in the story, the Burial Tide. I'd like to congratulate you. If I didn't say it earlier, congratulations on the book. I said
Thank
it.
you so
when I
much.
called you. It was a joy to read. But I also want to congratulate you on joining the sort of pantheon of seaside towns and horror stories you really don't want to go to, like the likes of Innsmouth and that kind of thing. You know, what was it like to sort of go in there and, you know, I know you said it's, you know, you're basing it on places that exist, but what was it like to go in there and say, right, I have a story to tell, this place has its own history. What was it like to start building all of that for this?
That was kind of, I say Ballydon was more kind of just the function of the plot is just like, I need the pub here, I need a place to go where she can meet Grania, I need the shop where she goes and meets Malachy. The only thing that I have no idea where the image of the guard sitting outside the police station playing a purple Game Boy Advance came from. It just popped into my head, and it was indelible, and I was just like, yeah, he's there. I have no idea where that came from, but he's there. It's
the exact type of thing you see in West Kerry, I'm going to be honest with you. It's just something so out of left field that you're almost scared to reach out and question it, you know? Yeah. Very much, very much. No, it's very well realized in the book, because it's like, even as I'm sitting and talking to you here, I can see the layout of the town, you know, the way that it is. And it has that sort of like centralizedness that is so familiar to everyone all over the country, don't get me wrong. But I know even in my hometown in Scartaglen, in Kerry, you know, the way that it's laid out is almost the exact same way, at least, you know, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but in my head, the temple is very much this thing in the epicenter, and the town is almost sort of like growing around it, like mycelium roots, you know? And that's the way they all are, but there's something very homey about it.
I'm writing a book at the moment about this girl. She's traveling home from Dublin to the kind of like the small country town, and she's just kind of like, as she's driving through the town, she's assessing the economic health of the town, and she says, well, you know, 4 of the 6 pubs are still in business, so they're doing okay.
Yeah, every kind of 21st of December coming up to that, you know, at home, it's always a question of like, oh my God, do you know how many pubs there used to be in Castle Island?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, and that's always like, you know, oh, before the bypass, you know, those conversations always happen. In the Irish mythology, very specifically, because it's something I've always had an interest in, but especially doing this series of this show, it's exposed me more than ever that like, for every like mockle and ugly or terrifying element in the mythology, there is this sort of like dichotomous explosion of beauty or like understanding or soul right after. In a horror story, you are the sole operative that is charged with portraying mythological elements. How do you find balancing that? Because I also understand that horror is something that happens over time. So how do you measure that over time of...
So I have basically at the end of Knock Knock Open Wide, I have an apology where I basically say, look, I tried to keep this as faithful to the mythology as possible, but I'm trying to write. I'm writing a horror novel here first and foremost, and this is what don't take this as a textbook. This
It's
is
not
kind of
gospel.
like, this is a mixture of like Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, kind of like filtered through Irish folklore. And so you kind of like, you just kind of got you basically, you just kind of make peace with the fact that every Irish storyteller who has told these stories has told their own version of it, and you are just one more link in that chain, no better, no worse, and there is no canon, but there is still, you still have to try and not twist it and bend it until it's nothing, like it's not even recognizable, because at that point you're just kind of like, you're just mining it for and exploiting it for your own ends. So you have to kind of like strike that balance between what is necessary for the work that you're trying to tell, while also being faithful to the stories that kind of like that came before.
Is there any folkloric element, like a tradition or a little bit of, folk magic, that kind of thing, or a monster that almost made it into this book, but then didn't? Because you have a bit of a pantheon going in this book.
Yeah. No, I think the basic elements were of the kind of like I won't say
Of
what
course.
it is. I won't say what
Yeah.
it is, but there are two broad folk traditions that I'm drawing from, and they were kind of like that remained consistent throughout the book I'm currently writing another book for Zando, and that one is pulling on a much wider kind of like cast of characters, if you like, and they will probably kind of like that will be chopped and changed a lot. I think it's more of a kind of like, it's more of a team up, it's more of a Marvel style team up, if you like. But no, it's kind of like what was in the what is in the book is more or less what I planned to have in the book, and it's more just kind of like, it was just finessing more than anything else.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, that's a pleasing answer on that way, because it like, you got to keep all of your intentionality.
Exactly,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Absolutely. Because you touched on it there, in regards to the fact that there is no canon, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no, and there's also, to give you some credit as well, there's also no guide on how to do this, because believe you me, even researching for this series, on in my part of things, if someone is approaching me and they're saying, I had an experience with this or that or whatever, and I have to go find it, it's all apocrypha. You know what I mean? It's all contradictory information, and you sort of have to see where the logic and the reason is, and what the wiser men than me, at least, sort of agree on, and that kind of thing. For you, what does it feel like? Because you have a book that's out now that I as far as I can tell, is doing quite well. What is it like to enter the canon, and especially for people who may have Irish roots over, like, abroad in America, and we're spread to all the corners of the earth. To be that kind of first introduction for, like, mythological things, and not even in terms of the specific ones that you use, but just in general, like, did that ever put pressure on you, to kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I do get a little bit nervous about kind of like someone kind of like reading, say, Knock Knock Open Wide, and saying, oh, well, the Morrigan is this, and all this kind of like, and she uses rings to control people and all this kind of stuff, and basically say like, no, that's I just pulled that out of my arse. And I'm sorry I led you astray. So what I just kind of like, but I mean, then there's no point about worrying about stuff that's out of your control. On the end of the day, I wrote a book, and I hope people enjoy it, and I hope that it led them on to delving into kind of like you say, like picking up maybe Lady Augusta Gregory's work, or Tom Kinsla's translation of the Táin Cúgailín, or maybe even learning Irish and going and looking at the originals. Anything is we're living in mad times like this. I've the last two events I've done, I've had to be brushing up on my Irish because they've been Oscailga.
I saw a clip of that actually, on Instagram. Yeah,
and it's just kind of like, on the one hand, it's so wonderful to see, but on the other hand, is you're also like, God, it's such hard work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, they're like, how do I say this? What's the word for the? Oh,
yeah. Yeah, and it's never a difficult word. It's always like the simplest word. It just makes it even more humiliating.
A complete tangent. I was just
By all means.
talking to someone at a First of Gaelgad event, and I couldn't think of the word for father-in-law, and she said, it's Ahar Kayla, and I was like, that can't be right. That sounds very dodgy. Oh no, I don't like that.
I think that like with this sort of like this cultural revival that's coming in, and you have not just your books that are dealing with this thing, but you're seeing a lot of authors delve into it, and I think you're also seeing a lot of fantasy television and video games pull from Irish mythology in a way
Japan were way ahead on this.
Japan have one of the best interpretations of Cuchulainn ever made. I can't give enough to those boys.
They're the Japanese, great bunch of lads.
Great bunch of lads, genuinely. No, they genuinely they. I think that there's one of the guests I had on the podcast earlier in the season, Declan Downey, has done a lot of work with universities in Japan, and he was saying how there's a lot of, this is a tangent, but bear with me. The Japanese people can relate a lot, I think, to Irish mythology because Shintoism has a lot of similarities with the sort of pre-Christian sort of religion and that kind of thing, with sort of different, shrines of Locust and that kind of thing. So, great bunch of lads is all I'm trying to say.
Very interesting.
Yeah, lovely man. But I wanted to say that like with all these other writers doing these things and all these, like you said, coming from all different sides, it's really interesting to hear non-Irish voices as well talk about Irish things and hear what they say. They don't always get it right. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
But I mean, I like when they try.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And with all that, I would like to think it sort of takes some of the pressure off you and also injects you with a bit of creative freedom. I think that after the success of Non-Hawking Open Wide, I hope, and the Burial Tide, I hope you can relax a bit more for the next one when you're doing it, because I could certainly understand the sort of pressure and the, oh God, what if they think, but not in your control at the end of the day. Yeah, just in general, but because you can correct me if you're wrong, but or if I'm wrong, if you're wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the Burial Tide and Knock Knock Open Wide, are they the only two horror novels that you've done?
Currently, yes. I am working on Zando have actually commissioned another one for me.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So, and I've written some short horror stuff. But yeah, it's relatively well. I mean, like writing fiction is a relatively new genre, a relatively new thing for me. I only before this I was a playwright.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So and it's interesting. So my very first novel, When the Sparrow Falls, was an adaptation of a stage play. What happened? So yeah, I was working on a play for the Abbey Theatre and a short film for RTE, and within the same month, both of those just went up in smoke. Which this was back in 2017, and that basically started me on a major mental health crisis.
I can imagine.
So by the end of the year, I was kind of like, I was in a very bad way, and I said, look, I've got to decouple my sense of self-worth from how well my writing is doing. Otherwise, this is not going to end well for me. So I took this play that I'd been writing for around 6 years on and off by that point. It was called The Caspian Sea, and I started adapting it as a novel just as a form of self-therapy. And because the play was already written, it was a very short process. So I started writing that at I think around November 2017, and by February 2018 I had the first draft ready, and it was substantially the book that ended up being published. And then from there I just kind of I sent that off to around 150 agents. One got back to me and said, yes, I'll take this on. And from there, and then I was on, and then it was around in the middle of when COVID was starting, or we're around a year into COVID, and I'd been offered the first book deal, and we were just kind of we were saying, well, the schools and the creche aren't open yet, but I'm supposed to go back to work. I'm just going to take the plunge, and I'm just going to work from home and just be a full-time writer. And amazingly, that didn't blow up in my face, and it's actually, and here I am. So those first not so when the Sparrow Falls is based on a play. Knock Knock Open Wide is actually, it's based on a stage monologue and the short film that I was writing for RTE, which was also called Knock Knock Open Wide, and I basically worked those two together and just finessed them into a single novel. And so so I think so my stage writing has had a huge effect on my novel writing, because a lot of the stuff I'm drawing from material that I've previously worked on for stage.
It must be pretty vindicating to have the specifically the short film, I suppose, blow up in smoke, and then have that to show for yourself at the end. That you have this novel, and then it.
If I get a
all
TV
right.
series out of it, that'll be even more vindicating.
Absolutely. Well, I would be first in line. I'll be there opening night. Yeah, I was going to ask, just in terms of the two books that you have written, that are, because now, I don't know how you classify it, but when I look at it, it's hard not to see them as sort of sister works, at least. You know what I mean? In the way of that they came out within recent times of each other, and they're both sort of following in the same sort of the folk horror genre, we'll say. Do you see it that way? Like, would you put them in the same world?
No, I don't. Yeah, maybe possibly the same world. Like, I think they kind of like you could. There's nothing that's explicitly contradicts. That Betty and Aisling aren't also existing in the world of Mara and Declan. They do feel like very different books to me. Knock Knock Open Wide is it's very personal. It's very autobiographical in many ways. Like, a lot of the kind of like I studied in UCD. I in the folklore department. I kind of like met the love of my life in Dramsoc. I spent a lot of time kind of like writing and acting in Dramsoc. I did some work in RTE as kind of like for transition year, but so that was kind of like drawing very, very heavily from my own life. Whereas The Burial Tide was something I was commissioned to write. And it's kind of like it's a book I'm very proud of. I think in many ways, like how I think of it is that Knock Knock Open Wide is maybe a better novel, but Burial Tide is a better horror novel. It's it's kind of like it's cleaner, it's tighter, it kind of like it's more focused, and that really is kind of like to do with working with an editor who kind of like is very, very good at plotting, which is something I always struggle with. So that's what, like, Knock Knock Open Wide is more heartfelt, but it's also a lot shaggier. It's more unfocused, and like, and some people like that, but a lot of people were kind of like put off about it, and it's that kind of like felt it was kind of meandering. Whereas Burial Tide is, I've got a lot of people saying, "Oh, I read this in one day," because it kind of, and that's to do that all that is comes from having an editor who is really, really, really fucking good at plotting beat after beat after beat after beat, which also is why it was such a quicker process to write as well. So they felt I understand why you kind of like, you think, oh well, they're both kind of like horrors drawing on Irish mythology. They feel like very different books to me though, and they were very different processes writing as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because it is sort of a thing of like, you know, for linked works, you almost want to be in the same position of heart, you know what I mean, to declare them, you know, thematically linked in such a way, you know. I think that as, you know, as standalone works, they probably get to breathe a little bit better as well within themselves. I'm definitely one of those people that flew through The Burial Tide. The pacing of the dissemination of information, that is just so gripping.
Oh, thank you.
You've kind of already answered this already, but what's next for you? Is it kind of more folk horror, or are you gonna, you know, take some distance from this and do something completely different?
Right. Well, so I'm kind of in the middle of how the process works with Zando. Is basically you're supposed to kind of like, you write them a sample and you send that off, and then they give you a green light to write the rest of the novel. So it's different. So because I've already kind of like done The Burial Tide with them, and they said they're very happy with that. So with the second, I can give you the title. The current working title of the next book is called Hell Puppies. and they've asked for a 10,000 word sample, so the first three to four chapters. So I've sent that off to them, and I have a bit of a holiday while I'm waiting for them to get back to me, either like saying, this is garbage, get out and never darken our doors again, or yeah, go ahead and write the rest of the book. So I have been working on a fantasy novel for like the past 4 years, just kind of like as my own personal project, which I have finally. So the bad news is I've realized it has to be 2 books, which I swore wasn't going to. I said, I am not. George R. R. Martin died for our sins to show why you don't let it bloat like that. You just finish the story. But I've gonna be like it's gotta be 2 books. But at least that means now I can say, well, book 1 is done. I have finished something.
Yeah.
I have accomplished something. So I'm gonna start like sending that out to beta readers and getting notes and before I can,
And that's separate from Hell Puppies.
completely. Yeah. This
Nice.
is I can say it is a stealth sequel to one of the 3 books that I have already written.
Okay.
But you don't have to have read it to understand what's going on. But it's kind of like, if you have read that book and you really, it's kind of like there's a lot of fun Easter eggs in it. And other than that, it's kind of like I feel after this year, I kind of feel like a children's author who just kind of like has a side hustle in writing for adults. Because I also published Don't Trust Fish, which has just exploded in a way that I never expected. And
It looks like it. And congratulations on that. It's
just
wonderful
like,
to see.
It's so bizarre. Like I passed books upstairs on the way here, and it was in the window there, and it's like I guess I'm a writer.
Yeah. When did that happen?
It's like I don't know if I can cope. But it's been doing very, very well, and it's been absolutely heartening to see. And so I'm also working on more children's books, and working on a few TV and movie projects that I would love to talk about,
But you can't.
I'm pretty sure that there will be masked men outside my window if I breathe the word. So
We'll say nothing.
yeah.
Well, I'm sure I'd love to talk more to you at the time when you could say something about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not for you, listener.
Yeah.
Go away. We're having our private talks.
Come
now.
back later. No, that's wonderful. I did want to touch on Don't Trust Fish because, and I'm a terrible interviewer in the fact that I haven't read it, but I wanted to ask, like, you know, because there are some things I know about it, is what I'll say. I feel like it's relevant enough to the show in that way. What's that process like? You know, and was that something that you planned on doing? Like, what brought that about?
Right. So that was such a fluke. I was. Look, and to quote Stanley, you know, I've told this story so many times that for all I know, it's true. So in the middle of COVID, we were on holiday with a bunch of kind of like our friends and their families. We all decided to kind of like we'd all been in our isolation bubbles. We said, look, we're going to rent a big house in Connemara, and we're just going to like have a holiday together. So we went down there, and it's absolutely beautiful. Just like Connemara, the only place in Ireland that even comes close to Kerry. And we realized that none of the kids had a birthday party in years because of Corona.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah. So we said, okay, we're going to throw them the kids a birthday party, but instead of buying them presents, we're all just going to pick it. You will be assigned a child, and you have to make that child a present. I am the least crafty person in the world, so I wrote my assigned child a picture book. Just kind of like just literally just a Word document and just like cribbing images off the internet, and I wrote that in a ridiculously short period of time, and just kind of like and read it to the kids, and the kids just kind of like were just cracking up. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to send this to my agent, and like my agent Jenny, she's fantastic, but she'd never done children's literature before, anything even close. She didn't have any connections in that kind of like whole space.
New world for her too.
Exactly. And I honestly thought she was gonna I'd send it off to her, and she'd send it back, and she said, look, this is not the kind of like material I represent. Go find yourself a children's lit agent. But she actually said, let me give it a try. And giving it a try turned out to be a 2-book deal with Penguin. So yeah, she's good. Like, first day on the job, she kind of like
she killed it.
yeah, and it's and like it's. And then before you know it, we're kind of like, yeah, we're getting offers for Turkish translation, Brazilian Portuguese translations, Chinese translation, French translation, and then of course I said, what about an Irish language translation? And they said, what, you do those? And so they sent it off to Angoom, and then Angoom, then we have Neil Aish Letrust, which is apparently which is actually how you grammatically correct, which believe it or not. And yeah, and it's just been snowballing all through the year. It's been mad.
I mean, it's wonderful though, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's. I think it's one of those...
makes you wonder why bother writing for adults. It's
yeah,
just like you spend a year cranking out something, and this like something you just wrote on the kitchen table. Just kind of like,
well, you do that so that someone from Kerry can pull you out of bed on a Friday morning and bring you into a recording studio. That's the joy from that. Yeah. No, I think it's wonderful, and I think it's. I'm delighted for you in it as well, because it's one of those things where, like, you know, you put your heart and soul into doing something, you know, like you mentioned. Because would I be right in saying that Don't Trust Fish came up before The Burial Tide, after Knock Knock Open Wide?
Yeah, so it came out in April of this year.
Right.
And The Burial Tide was, I think, September this year.
September, yeah. It has to be therapeutic to be working, like, so hard on something, and then, you know, you described it as a fluke. I probably wouldn't use that word. You know, I do think you're very talented, but it's, you know, from your perspective, it's got to be very relieving that it's like, oh, okay, things work.
Just the fact that, like, I was 13 years in an office job that was slowly killing me, and just the fact that I still can't believe that I get to just kind of like get up and just do something that I love, and, like, you know, still put groceries on the table, and just kind of like, and support the family, and it's incredible.
Yeah,
it's I cannot believe that I've been this lucky.
Well deserved, I would say.
You're very kind. Thank you.
I guess moving from sort of like a metropolitan kind of, you know, like the UCD, and you know, you're in the realm of large urban environments and stuff like that, if you want to pull the book there, with Knock Knock Open Wide, and then moving to something that is so rural in The Burial Tide. Was that freeing or restrictive, kind of, in that sense?
I didn't really, it's easier in the sense that when you're kind of like, I was able to just create Inish Bannock from scratch, which you can't do with Dublin. Dublin already exists.
Yeah.
People. So it's kind of like with Dublin, I'm kind of like, I'm doing research and it's like, okay, this street is here. So how long would it take her? And does it make sense that you kind of like that it's this time of the day and all that kind of stuff? So you're kind of like, you're trying to, I think that is more restrictive in a way. Whereas Inish Bannock, like, yes, it's in a real place. It's in County Kerry, and you are restricted by the rules of kind of like reality to a certain extent, but it's very freeing in that, so it's almost like you're writing a fantasy novel and you're creating your own kind of like realm. So I think I'd say it was more freeing.
Yeah. No, definitely. Is there, and this is not necessarily a book related question, more of a personal one, just while we're on the subject, is there a personal favorite, like, folkloric kind of monster or creature that you have that you're obsessed with?
I recently, hang on a second, I'm just going to turn on my phone because I want to pull this out.
Yeah, by all means.
So I've been rereading. Rereading sounds like I've read them before. I was reading for the first time Lady Augusta Gregory's translations, and coming across like all kinds of stuff that I didn't know. And like you think there's what you think you know, but there's also the unknown unknowns. Like you mentioned the Children of Lear. And I was boring my wife and everyone I know with talking about like the stuff that I discovered about Lear.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you just learn the version that you've heard in school about, you know, King Lear, it's like old man, oh, my children are swans, oy vey. And it's just like, you think that's just like a sad old man. No. Lear is a fucking badass. Like there's a story where the Tuatha De Danann are choosing their new high king, and they choose a guy called Bov Darug. And Lear is all, no, you're not my high king. You're not my king. I didn't vote for you. I'm going home. And he's just kind of like, and all Bov Darug's advisors are like, you have to kill him now. You realize that he's openly flaunting your authority. You've got to get this guy. And Bov Darug's like, no, we are not fucking with him. If you start shit with that man, he will come to your house, he will burn it down, and he will kill you. So it was cute that I didn't know that that Lear was actually a far more interesting character.
I didn't know that at all either.
Yeah.
I'm underread in Lady Gregory's myself. I've been reading Lady Wiles at the moment as well.
Oh wow.
Which are very interesting as well, and worth exploring if you haven't. But I didn't know that he was that sort of a figure. I mean, all the Tuatha are kind of characterized as sort of warring in a way, but depending on depending on who's writing them, they're always, sometimes they're literally warring against, sometimes they fight in poem and that kind of thing, and they only do that,
So I found it. So I've become obsessed with this one story. Sorry, when I say story, it's a paragraph. There's literally this one paragraph that Lady Augusta Rae just drops in. So you know the Morrigan. Did you know she had a son?
No.
Right. So I didn't either. So I'm just going to read this. And Mechi, the son the Morrigan had, was killed by Macecht on Magmechi, that till that time had been called Magthurtiga. 3 hearts he had, and it is the way they were. They had the shapes of 3 serpents through them. And if Mechi had not met with his death, those serpents in him would have grown, and what they left alive in Ireland would have wasted away. And Macecht burned the 3 hearts on Magluhud, the plain of ashes, and he threw the ashes into the stream, and the rushing water of the stream stopped and boiled up, and every creature in it died. And that is all we hear about that guy.
Why is that all we hear about? Where did he come?
Just drops. Lady Gregory just comes in, drops this nightmare in front of us, and just pieces out.
That was Ragnarok in a paragraph right there.
Who the hearts in his 3 hearts and the serpents? What the fuck?
That is, and that's the only reference given to that character
in that book. Yeah, I've looked on.
I've never heard of him either, and I mean, I've got the lady on my hand, you know.
Yeah,
so yeah. That's interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah, you go.
Mechi,
yeah.
You give me another episode to do. The lost episode of Irish mythology.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Okay, I'm glad I asked that question. I've
very
learned something new.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you, and this is a recurring thing. I ask everyone who I put a microphone in front of, because I can and I have to, given the show. Not just in regards to completely Irish folklore, but just, this show. I was trying to explain to a friend recently about how, if you've ever heard of any kind of Irish creature or monster or ghost or whatever, they're all fairies.
Yes.
Because fairy is not what you think it means.
Yes.
Especially as a foreign audience member.
Yeah.
It's a lot closer to like dead precursor god sleeping kind of thing,
which is also confused because then by around the 17th and 18th century, a lot of European fairy lore is crossing over into Ireland and getting incorporated in, which are closer to what we think of as fairies with kind of like little people with wings. So it's a mess.
It is a mess. But I always ask people, because if you have any kind of encounter, I cover fairies extensively on the show, and if you have any kind of encounter with anything supernatural in this world, at least in this country, you can lay it down to a fairy. Have you ever had any kind of experience or anything like that? Or if not, what drew you kind of into folklore in the first place?
Right. Well, I mean, that's an easy question. So my mother has worked in the Department of Folklore for many, many years. So I kind of like I have not had personally, I've not had a supernatural encounter. Apart from I saw a UFO once. But I'm pretty sure it was just I was overtired and I looked out the window and there was a street lamp there, but it looked very much like there was a flying saucer outside my window. But I think my mother had a friend who had an encounter with some hungry grass.
Wow.
Yeah. And the detail that I always took in my head is that she had a packet of potato crisps on her that saved her life. So I don't know. Have you ever discussed Hungry Grass? Should I?
Not on this show, but please go ahead.
Right.
I looked into it and I wanted to make an episode on it, but I couldn't find anyone with the story.
Yeah. So Hungry Grass is, according to lore, is a place, just a patch of grass in a field where someone died of hunger during the famine, and that if you step on this patch, you will experience incredible, like, lethal hunger. And so my mother says that a friend of hers did experience this, and she was just walking out in the countryside, and she stepped on a patch of grass, and she just keeled over, and she just felt like she was literally dying of hunger. But she had ironically enough, she had a packet of potato crisps on her, and she was just and she ate them, and she was able to kind of like to overcome that. As I said, like I'm not calling my mother a liar. I might be calling my mother's friend a liar.
Yeah.
That's my kind of like contribution.
Yeah,
there.
that's really interesting though, because that's one that you and maybe it's different up in whichever area of the country that lady may be from, but at least down in Kerry, like, that's not one that comes up often. In Kerry, it's all banshees.
Really?
That's,
okay.
Yeah, like in the hill I live on is I'm dreadful for Irish. I always said, like, if when rich people get really rich and try to get a higher class, they take piano lessons.
Yeah.
I'll take Irish lessons. That's what I'll do, and I'll become fluent then. But the translation of the hill that I live on up in Scartaglen is called the Hill of the Ghosts.
Okay.
And there's a couple different stories on that hill. Like, there's one story that one of the Earl Desmonds was killed there by a banshee that hunted him down, or something like that.
There are, like, people think, banshees just kind of like, she'll howl and then you hear and you're going to die, but there are some much nastier banshee stories out there.
There are, and even like the variants, like, I mean, like, I think a lot of people stop looking at the banshee. There's all these other, like, really interesting, like, sort of figures that are right on the cusp of it, like the Leon and she, and there's a couple of different that are just straight up energy vampires for specific types of people. But no, that's a really interesting one, because at least down there or in my parts, that's a really obscure one.
Really?
Definitely,
okay.
yeah. That, and I wanted to do an episode on that, on the Far Gorta as well. But I couldn't find anyone for it. But Neil, where can people get your stuff? Where can people buy your books?
Don't Trust Fish is available in all good bookshops. Knock Knock Open Wide, unfortunately, is not available in shops over here yet. We have actually just signed a deal with a UK publisher, so you'll start seeing it over here. I think in 2027, if you can wait that long. Otherwise, I won't judge you if you just order it online.
I had to do it. I had to do it. It's in my backpack right now.
And Burial Tide. Just like it's 2025. Just Google it. You'll find somewhere selling it. Buy local if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Uno Reverse. I also have a podcast.
You do?
Yeah. It's that's what I call nostalgia. I do that with my friend Esther and my wife Aoife. I probably should have that order probably was wrong, but I'll get in trouble for that. But we talk about just like kids shows that we grew up with in Ireland in the 80s and 90s. We're going to be doing an episode on Bosco soon enough, but definitely check us out. And also my blog, unshavedmouse.com. I would love to see you there.
If you're watching the YouTube version, there will be a link to his podcast on... Is it on YouTube and Spotify? Is it on Spotify? Where do they get it?
Spotify.
Spotify?
And I think of a couple of the other podcast apps, but not on YouTube.
There will be a link to the show in the description of this video. You should go check it out. Neil does a good show on there. And for anyone who's very nostalgic about the kind of time... Is mostly, correct me if I'm wrong, mostly 80s, 90s kind of stuff?
Yes.
If you're nostalgic for that, if you want a vibe, go check it out. Neil, thanks for coming on the show. This was an electrifying conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to what you do next.
You're a gentleman. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Woo! We got through the stutters fairly fast.
Yeah, that was good. That was very good.